The mountains don't forgive carelessness, and they don't forget kindness either. Dr. Elena Marsh had learned both truths the hard way over the 3 years she'd lived alone on the eastern ridge of the Appalachian wilderness, far enough from civilization that the nearest town was just a smudge of orange light in the valley below when night fell. Her cabin sat tucked against a limestone outcropping, surrounded by ancient hemlocks that had witnessed centuries pass beneath their branches. The air always smelled of pine resin and cold stone, sharp and clean in a way that made the stuffiness of her former life. Conference rooms, faculty meetings, the bitter politics of academia feel like something that had happened to someone else entirely. Every morning, she woke before dawn to the sound of the creek rushing over smooth rocks behind the cabin. She would step onto the porch, mug of black coffee warming her hands, and breathe in the mountain quiet. No colleagues whispering behind her back. No departmental investigations. No ex-husband's lawyer serving papers while she stood in front of her students. Just the wind moving through the pines and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk claiming its territory. Life had become predictable in the best possible way. Chop wood, haul water from the spring, check the solar panels, catalog the few remaining artifacts from her fieldwork days. Pottery shards, arrowheads, fragments of the past she'd once believed would define her future. She'd been an archaeologist once, specializing in pre-Columbian settlements in the southern highlands. Dr. Elena Marsh, published researcher, respected academic, until the day a grad student fabricated evidence to discredit her findings and advance his own career. The university had sided with him. Tenure vanished. Reputation destroyed. Marriage collapsed under the weight of public humiliation. So she'd come here, to the place her grandmother had left her in the will. A cabin no one else wanted, on land too steep and rocky for development. And she discovered that solitude, real solitude, could be a kind of healing if you let it. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story is touching you already, make sure you're subscribed. I've got something extra special saved for tomorrow. The Panther changed everything. It was late October when Elena first saw her, though saw wasn't quite accurate. She'd heard the gunshot echo through the valley, sharp, ugly, wrong, and then silence that felt too heavy. Hunters weren't supposed to be on this ridge. The land was protected, marked clearly with Forest Service signs. But rules meant nothing to men who saw dollar signs and exotic pelts. Elena had grabbed her medical kit. Habits from her old life died hard and followed the sound. She found the Panther half a mile into the forest, caught in a rusted leg-hold trap some bastard had set illegally near the game trail. The animal's left hind leg was mangled, blood pooling in the leaves. A bullet had grazed her shoulder, leaving a raw furrow through black fur. The Panther's golden eyes tracked Elena's approach with a mixture of rage and exhaustion, lips pulled back to reveal teeth that could crush bone. "I know," Elena had whispered, crouching low, making herself small. "I know you want to kill me, but if you don't let me help, you're going to die here." The Panther's growl rumbled like distant thunder, but she was too weak to lunge, too wounded to run. Elena worked quickly, using bolt cutters to snap the trap's jaws, then carefully, cleaning and stitching the wounds with supplies meant for humans but adaptable enough for desperate circumstances. She'd injected antibiotics, wrapped the leg, and half expected to be mauled at any moment. The Panther never attacked. She watched Elena with those burning gold eyes, and when it was done, she simply limped away into the undergrowth without looking back. Elena told herself that was the end of it. A strange encounter. A story she'd never tell anyone because no one would believe her anyway. But 2 nights later, the Panther appeared on her porch. Not threatening. Not wounded anymore, though she still favored the injured leg. Just sitting there in the moonlight, like a shadow given form, watching the cabin with an intensity that made Elena's skin prickle. When Elena stepped outside, the Panther stood, dipped her head once, almost like a nod, and vanished into the trees. After that, she came every few nights, always at dusk or just after dark, never approaching closer than the porch steps. Sometimes she'd sit for an hour, watching, sometimes only minutes. Elena started leaving out venison from her hunts, though she wasn't sure the Panther ever took it. The meat would be gone by morning, but coyotes and ravens were just as likely. Then, 3 weeks ago, the gift started. The first one appeared on the porch railing at dawn, a smooth river stone, palm size, with a hole worn through the center by centuries of water flow. Elena had picked it up, frowning, turning it over in her hands. Not unusual in itself. The creek was full of such stones, but this one had been placed deliberately on the railing, not scattered there by wind or animal. She'd shrugged it off. Maybe a raven's doing. They collected odd objects. The second gift came 2 nights later. A piece of pottery, no bigger than her thumb, with a distinctive incised pattern along the edge. Elena's breath had caught. She recognized that pattern. Mississippian culture, probably 800 to 1,000 years old. Definitely not something that should be lying around on her porch. The third gift was a copper bead, green with patina. The fourth was a carved bone fragment with geometric designs. The fifth was a stone pendant shaped like a bird. By the sixth gift, a perfectly preserved obsidian blade that made her hand shake when she held it, Elena knew exactly what was happening, even if she couldn't explain how. The Panther was bringing her artifacts, pre-Columbian artifacts, valuable, historically significant pieces that shouldn't exist this far north, this far from known Mississippian settlement sites. Each one carefully placed on her porch railing or doorstep, always at night, always when Elena wasn't watching. She tried staying awake, tried catching the Panther in the act. But the animal was too clever, too patient. Elena would drift off for just a moment, and when she checked again, another artifact would be waiting. A shell gorget, a small clay effigy, a piece of worked mica that caught the light like trapped fire. Her academic training screamed at her. These pieces should be documented, carbon dated, analyzed. They could rewrite understanding of indigenous migration patterns, trade routes, cultural exchange. They could prove everything she'd been trying to prove before her career collapsed. But another part of her, the part that had learned to trust the mountain's rhythms, whispered something different. The Panther was trying to show her something, led her somewhere, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to follow. The decision came on a cold November morning when frost painted the world silver. Elena stepped onto the porch to find not one artifact, but 3, arranged in a careful line pointing toward the forest. A ceramic shard, a bone tool, and something that made her heart stop. A small gold disc, no larger than a quarter, stamped with symbols she'd only seen in museum collections of Spanish colonial artifacts. Gold, Spanish gold, in the Appalachian wilderness. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The metal was warm despite the freezing air, as though it had been carried in something's mouth. She turned it over, studying the markings. Definitely 16th or 17th century. Definitely authentic. Worth thousands to collectors. Worth infinitely more to historians. And the Panther had just left it on her porch like a dinner invitation. Elena stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. She could take these artifacts to authorities, try to restart her career, prove she'd been right all along about indigenous settlements in these mountains. Or she could do what every instinct was telling her to do. She could follow the Panther and find out where these treasures were coming from. The smart choice was obvious. The safe choice was clear. Elena went inside, pulled on her hiking boots, packed her field bag with supplies, water, rope, first aid kit, flashlight, her old archaeology tools she hadn't touched in 3 years. She loaded her grandfather's rifle, not because she thought she'd need it for the Panther, but because the mountains held other dangers. Then she tucked the gold disc carefully into her breast pocket, feeling it rest against her heart like a question waiting to be answered. When she stepped back outside, the Panther was waiting at the edge of clearing. The great cat sat motionless, black coat gleaming in the morning light. Golden eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that felt almost human. When Elena took a step forward, the Panther stood. When Elena hesitated, the Panther's tail flicked once, impatient, beckoning. "All right," Elena whispered to the Panther, to whatever force had set this strange dance in motion. "Show me." The Panther turned and walked into the forest. Elena followed. The trail was nothing Elena had ever mapped. She knew these mountains intimately. Every ridge, every hollow, every game trail marked on her hand-drawn surveys. But the panther led her along a route that twisted through terrain Elena had somehow never explored, despite 3 years of wandering. They moved deeper into the wilderness, away from a valley, climbing steadily toward the higher peaks. The panther set a pace that was neither fast nor slow, stopping occasionally to look back and ensure Elena was keeping up. Her injured leg barely showed a limp now, healed with the remarkable resilience of wild things. The forest changed as they climbed. Old-growth hemlocks gave way to twisted oaks, then a stands of birch that stood like white bones against the gray November sky. The air grew colder, thinner, carrying scents Elena couldn't name, mineral-rich stone, ancient earth, something almost metallic that made her think of the gold disc resting against her chest. They'd been walking for nearly 2 hours when the panther stopped abruptly at the base of a limestone cliff. Elena caught up, breathing hard, legs burning from the climb. The cliff face rose 30 feet, covered in thick moss and hanging vines that dripped with moisture from a morning frost. The panther approached the cliff and disappeared. Elena blinked. One moment the animal was there, the next gone, as if the stone had simply swallowed her whole. Heart pounding, Elena moved closer. Her fingers brushed aside the hanging vines, and she understood. A crack in the cliff face, hidden completely by vegetation, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The panther must have slipped inside. Elena pulled her flashlight from her pack, clicked it on, and aimed the beam into the darkness. The light caught rough stone walls, a narrow passage leading downward into the mountain's belly. Cold air breathed out from the opening, carrying that metallic scent stronger now, mixed with something else. Old smoke, ancient dust, the smell of places undisturbed for centuries. Every bit of her archaeological training said to stop, call authorities, get proper equipment, document everything before disturbing the site. But the panther's golden eyes haunted her memory. 3 weeks of gifts, 3 weeks of trust being built between woman and wild creature. And the gold disc against her heart seemed to pulse with warmth, urging her forward. Elena squeezed through the opening. The passage was tight, forcing her to turn sideways, pack scraping against stone. Water trickled somewhere in the darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, making her breath form pale clouds in the flashlight beam. She moved carefully, testing each step, one hand on the wet stone wall for balance. After 20 feet, the passage widened abruptly, opening into a chamber that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Her flashlight beam swept across walls covered in symbols, not painted, but carved deep into the limestone, spirals and geometric patterns. Human figures with elaborate headdresses, animals she recognized, deer, bear, panther, and others she didn't, serpentine shapes that seemed to move in the dancing shadows. The style was Mississippian, definitely, but older than anything she'd seen in her research. More elaborate, more sophisticated. The chamber was maybe 20 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. And there, in the center, sat the panther. Behind her, piled carefully against the far wall, was a collection that made Elena's knees weak. Pottery vessels, dozens of them, in various sizes and stages of preservation. Stone tools arranged in careful rows. Shell gorgets hanging from natural hooks in the stone. Copper ornaments that gleamed dully in the flashlight beam. And scattered throughout, glinting like fallen stars, gold. Gold discs. Gold beads. A gold pectoral piece shaped like a sun. Spanish colonial artifacts mixed with indigenous work. Proof of contact, trade, possibly conflict between cultures centuries ago. This wasn't just a cache. This was a burial chamber, a sacred site, and it had been hidden undisturbed for hundreds of years. The panther watched Elena's reaction with those knowing golden eyes. She shifted her weight, and something clinked softly. At her feet lay another artifact, a small clay vessel with a fitted lid, different from the others, more carefully made, more deliberately placed. The panther nudged it with her nose, pushing it toward Elena. Elena approached slowly, reverently. She knelt beside the panther, close enough to feel the animal's warmth, to hear her breathing, to die if the panther chose violence over trust. But the great cat simply watched as Elena reached for the vessel. It was heavier than it looked. The clay was smooth, burnished to a soft sheen that spoke of expert craftsmanship. The lid fit perfectly, sealed with something that looked like pine resin. Elena's fingers traced the rim, feeling the faint impressions of the potter's hands. Some unknown artisan who had created this piece centuries before her birth. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in what had once been leather but was now just fragments, lay a folded piece of paper. Paper, not parchment, not ancient, modern. Elena's hand shook as she carefully lifted it out. The paper was yellowed, brittle with age, but not centuries old. Decades, maybe. Her flashlight beam fell across handwriting she didn't recognize. Faded ink that had bled slightly from moisture but was still legible. The first line made her heart stop. If you are reading this, it means the guardian has chosen you. The mountain keeps its secrets close, but some truths are too important to remain buried. She read on, pulse thundering in her ears. My name is Thomas Whitfield. I discovered this chamber in 1962 while surveying for the lumber company. What I found here changed my understanding of everything we thought we knew about these mountains. This is not just a burial site. It is a repository, a sacred vault where the last survivors of the Yuchi people hid their most precious possessions when the Spanish came hunting for gold in 1567. The conquistadors never found this place. The mountain hid it from them, just as it has hidden it from everyone since. I documented everything I could, but I never reported it. The lumber company would have destroyed it. Treasure hunters would have looted it. Academics would have turned it into a circus. Instead, I sealed the entrance, took nothing, and swore to protect it. I have left this note in the hope that someday someone worthy would be led here. If the Panther bloodline has survived, if one of them has chosen to reveal this place to you, then you are that person. Protect it. Honor it. The gold is worth a fortune, but the history is priceless. These people trusted the mountain to keep their legacy safe. Now the mountain is trusting you. Do not fail them. Below the signature was a date, October 15th, 1962. And below that, in shakier handwriting as if added later, the Guardian's line is strong. They remember. Trust them. Elena lowered the letter, vision blurring. The Panther sat motionless beside her, a living link to a promise made 60 years ago, a bloodline that had been protecting this chamber for generations. Not by accident, not by instinct alone, by choice. She looked around the chamber with new eyes. This wasn't random collection. Every piece was placed deliberately. The pottery vessels were arranged by size and type. The tools were organized by function. Someone, Thomas Whitfield probably, following the original arrangement, had treated this place with the reverence it deserved. And now that responsibility was being passed to her. Elena's throat tightened. 3 years ago, her career had been destroyed for trying to prove that indigenous cultures in these mountains were more sophisticated, more connected, more resilient than conventional archaeology acknowledged. She'd been laughed out of conferences, called a fraud, told her evidence was wishful thinking. And here, in a chamber hidden by the mountain itself, protected by a line of panthers that remembered an old man's promise, was proof of everything she'd been trying to say. The irony was almost too much to bear. She could take this public, vindicate herself, rewrite the textbooks, restore her reputation, or she could do what Thomas Whitfield had done. Protect it, honor it, keep the mountain's trust. The Panther's tail flicked once, breaking her spiral of thoughts. The great cat stood, stretched, and padded toward the passage they'd entered through. At the opening, she looked back, golden eyes catching the flashlight beam. The message was clear. You've seen it. Now decide. Elena carefully returned the letter to its vessel, replaced the lid, and set it back exactly where she'd found it. She stood slowly, knees protesting, and looked one more time at the impossible treasure surrounding her. Spanish gold mixed with Yuchi's sacred objects. Proof of contact. Proof of survival. Proof that even when empires tried to erase them, some people found ways to preserve what mattered most. Her hand moved to the gold disc in her pocket. She pulled it out, looked at it one last time, then walked to the wall and placed it carefully among the other gold pieces. It belonged here. They all belonged here. The Panther made a sound, not quite a purr, not quite a growl, something like approval, Elena followed her back through the narrow passage, squeezing through stone, climbing toward daylight. When they emerged into the cold November air, she took a deep breath and felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing exactly. Something harder to name. Purpose, maybe. Or responsibility. Or the weight of a trust she hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. The Panther led her back down the mountain, taking a slightly different route that was easier to navigate. They emerged at Elena's cabin just as the sun began its descent toward the western ridges, painting the world in shades of amber and gold. At the edge of the clearing, the Panther stopped. She turned to face Elena one last time, and for a moment, woman and wild animals simply looked at each other. 3 years of solitude, 3 weeks of strange gifts, and now a shared secret that could never be told. Elena nodded slowly. I understand. I'll protect it. The Panther's ears flicked forward. Then she turned and disappeared into the forest, black coat melting into the lengthening shadows. Elena stood on her porch as night claimed the mountains, the weight of what she discovered pressing against her ribs with every breath. She had found treasure beyond price. She had found truth that could restore everything she'd lost, and she was going to bury it again, keep it secret, let the mountain decide when, if ever, the world was ready to know. But even as she made that decision, even as she felt the rightness of it settle into her bones, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. Thomas Whitfield had kept the secret. The Panther bloodline had kept the secret. But secrets have a way of being discovered. And somewhere out there, someone else was looking. The first sign that Elena's secret wouldn't stay buried came 3 days after she'd followed the Panther to the chamber. She was chopping behind the cabin, the satisfying thunk of the axe biting into seasoned oak filling the cold morning air, when she heard the sound of an engine grinding up the access road, her hands still mid-swing. In 3 years, she'd had exactly 2 visitors, a lost hiker and a Forest Service ranger doing routine patrols. The access road was barely maintained, more suggestion than reality, washing out with every hard rain. No one came up here unless they had a specific reason. Elena set down the axe and walked around to the front of the cabin, wiping her hands on her jeans. A dark green SUV with mud-splattered sides pulled into the clearing, expensive and new enough to look completely out of place against the weathered backdrop of her homestead. The engine cut off, and a man stepped out. He was maybe 50, dressed in what Elena recognized as outdoorsman cosplay, brand-new hiking boots that had never seen a real trail, a fleece jacket still creased from its packaging, designer sunglasses that probably cost more than her monthly propane budget. His hair was silver at the temples in a way that looked calculated rather than natural, and his smile was too white, too practiced. Dr. Marsh? He called out, raising one hand in greeting. I hope I'm not intruding. Every muscle in Elena's body tightened. No one called her doctor anymore. No one except people who'd done their research. You've got the wrong person, she said, keeping her voice flat. No doctors up here. Just Elena. And you are. The man's smile didn't waver. He approached with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted, stopping a respectful distance away. Robert Hawthorne. I'm a historical consultant working with the Appalachian Heritage Foundation. We're conducting surveys of pre-colonial settlement patterns in the region. He pulled out a business card, held it toward her. Elena didn't take it. Never heard of you. We're a private organization. Hawthorne continued smoothly, funded by donations from individuals interested in preserving indigenous history. I was hoping I might ask you a few questions about the area. Your grandmother, Iris Whitfield, owned this land for over 40 years. I thought you might have knowledge of any historical sites or artifacts she may have mentioned. The name hit Elena like a physical blow. Whitfield, Thomas Whitfield's family name. Her grandmother had been a Whitfield before she married, which meant her thoughts raced. Thomas had sealed the chamber in 1962. Had he told his sister? Had her grandmother known about the treasure the entire time Elena was growing up, listening to stories on this very porch? My grandmother died 6 years ago, Elena said carefully. She never mentioned anything about artifacts or historical sites. This is just mountain land, rock and trees, and not much else. Hawthorne smiled thin slightly. Of course, though I understand you have some expertise in this area yourself. Before your career change, you specialized in Mississippian settlements in the Southern Highlands, published several papers on trade networks and cultural exchange. So he knew he'd done his homework, dug into her background, found her destroyed reputation, and followed her here like a bloodhound on a scent. That was a long time ago, Elena said. I don't do that kind of work anymore. A shame. Hawthorne glanced around the clearing, his gaze lingering on the porch railing where the Panther had left her gifts. You had some interesting theories. Controversial, but interesting. About indigenous populations having more extensive contact with Spanish explorers than previously documented. About sacred caches hidden in the mountains to protect cultural treasures from conquistadors. Elena's pulse hammered against her throat. Those were her theories. The ones she'd been laughed at for proposing. The ones that had made her colleagues call her a fantasist. Too invested in romantic notions to see objective truth. Like I said, she repeated, that was a long time ago. Hawthorne finally looked back at her, and for just a moment, the pleasant facade slipped. His eyes were cold, calculating, the eyes of a man who saw dollar signs where others saw history. Dr. Marsh, I'm going to be direct with you. We have reason to believe there may be significant archaeological sites on or near this property, sites that could have tremendous historical value. If you were to share any information you might have, even family stories, local legends, the Foundation would be very generous in compensating you. How generous? Elena asked, surprising herself. Hawthorne's smile returned, sharper now. That would depend on the significance of the information. But we're talking 6 figures minimum, possibly 7, depending on what's found. Money like that could change her life. Buy a real house down in the valley. Pay off debts. Maybe even fund independent research, away from the politics that had destroyed her career. But she thought of Thomas Whitfield's letter, the Panther's golden eyes, the sacred objects arranged with such care in the chamber, and she felt something harden in her chest like stone. I don't have any information, she said, and I'd appreciate it if you left my property. Hawthorne studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, slipping his business card back into his pocket. Of course. I apologize for the intrusion. He turned toward his SUV, then paused. One more thing, Dr. Marsh. If you do happen to remember anything, any stories, any unusual findings, I hope you'll reach out. Because whether you help us or not, we will find what we're looking for. It would be better for everyone if we work together. It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't quite not a threat either. Elena watched him drive away, the SUV's engine fading into the distance until the mountain quiet returned. But the quiet felt different now. Watched, waiting. She walked back into the cabin and immediately went to the small lockbox where she kept her grandmother's papers, birth certificates, property deeds, a few photographs, and there at the bottom, a journal she'd never paid much attention to before. Her grandmother's handwriting, faded but still legible. Elena flipped through the pages, grocery lists, weather notes, reminders about when to plant a garden. Nothing unusual until she reached an entry from 1985. Thomas came by today. He looked older, tired. Said he'd been having dreams about the mountain, about the guardian. Made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd watch over the land, keep it in the family. He wouldn't say more, but his eyes had that haunted look he got when he'd been drinking, or when he was keeping secrets too heavy to carry alone. Elena's hands trembled as she turned the page. Another entry, dated 1990. Saw the black cat again today. The big one that's been around these mountains my whole life. Impossible, of course. Panthers don't live that long. But it watched me from the ridge, just like it used to watch Thomas. Maybe it's the grandchild of the one he knew. Or maybe some things in these mountains don't follow normal rules. And then, from 1998, shortly before her grandmother's death, I'm leaving the land to Elena. She has Thomas's curiosity and my stubbornness. If anyone can handle what's buried here, it's her. I only hope she's strong enough to do what Thomas did. Sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to keep silent. Elena closed the journal and sat in the gathering darkness of her cabin. understanding crystallizing like ice in her veins. Her grandmother had known. Maybe not the exact location. Maybe not the full extent of what Thomas had found. But she'd known something precious was hidden on this land. And she'd left it to Elena not just as inheritance, but as responsibility. The question was, how did Robert Hawthorne know? The answer came 2 nights later. Elena woke to the sound of the Panther's warning call, a low, urgent vocalization she'd never heard before. She was out of bed instantly, grabbing her rifle, moving to the window. The moon was full, painting the clearing in silver light. And there at the edge of the trees stood 3 men. They weren't dressed for hiking. Dark clothing, heavy boots, headlamps switched off. One carried surveying equipment. Another had what looked like a metal detector. The third held something that made Elena's blood run cold, ground-penetrating radar. The kind archaeologists use to map subsurface features without excavating. They were searching, methodically, professionally, and they were getting closer to the trail the Panther had led her down. The Panther herself was a shadow among shadows, circling the men at a distance, keeping between them and the path to the chamber. Her movements were predatory now, not the calm patience she'd shown Elena. This was the mountain's guardian doing what her bloodline had done for generations, protecting what humans should not find. Elena's mind raced. She could call the sheriff, but by the time anyone arrived, these men could have found entrance. She could confront them herself, but 3 armed men against 1 woman with a hunting rifle. Those were bad odds even if she was willing to risk violence. Then she remembered something her grandmother used to say. The mountain takes care of its own. Sometimes you just have to trust it. Elena set down the rifle and grabbed her flashlight instead. She walked out onto the porch, making no effort to be quiet. The men's heads snapped toward her, catching in their movements like deer in headlights. Private property, Elena called out, her voice carrying across the clearing. You're trespassing. One of the men, the one with the metal detector, stepped forward. We have permission from the Appalachian Heritage Foundation to conduct surveys in this area. The foundation doesn't own this land. I do, and you need to leave. Now. Ma'am, we're just doing historical research. At midnight, with equipment you're trying to hide. Elena cut him off. That's not research. That's theft. You've got 60 seconds to get off my property before I call the authorities. The men exchanged glances. The one with the radar equipment spoke into a radio. Words too quiet for Elena to hear. A response crackled back. They were communicating with someone. Hawthorne, probably, waiting down the mountain for them to report what they found. We'll go, the first man said finally. But Dr. Marsh, you should know. This area is about to be designated for archaeological study, whether you cooperate or not. The state has processes for this kind of thing. Eminent domain for sites of historical significance. Elena's stomach dropped. They were threatening to take her land legally, claim the chamber as state property, excavate it, catalog it, turn it into exactly the circus Thomas Whitfield had feared. Get out, she said, her voice like stone. The men retreated, disappearing into the trees. But Elena knew this wasn't over. It was barely beginning. The Panther emerged from the shadows and approached the porch. Her golden eyes reflected the moonlight, unblinking, urgent. She made a low sound, not quite a growl, more like a question. Elena understood. They know something's here. They're going to keep looking. The Panther's tail lashed once, sharp and frustrated. I know, Elena whispered. I know we can't let them find it. But how did you hide a secret that was already being hunted? The next morning, Elena drove down to the county seat for the first time in 8 months. The small mountain town of Ashford hadn't changed. Same brick buildings, same diner on Main Street, same courthouse with its weathered columns and Confederate monument that had sparked protests every summer for the last decade. She parked in front of the county clerk's office and went inside, requesting copies of the property records for her land and the surrounding area. The clerk, a tired woman named Martha, who'd gone to school with Elena's mother, raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Elena spread the documents across a table in the corner of the office, tracing property lines, ownership history, mineral rights. And there, buried in the legal language, she found it. A survey request filed 3 weeks ago by the Appalachian Heritage Foundation, seeking permission to conduct non-invasive archaeological assessment of a 12-square-mile area that included Elena's property. The request cited preliminary research suggesting potential sites of historical significance and public interest in preserving indigenous cultural heritage. It was dated 2 days before the Panther's first gift appeared on her porch. Elena's hands went numb. That meant Hawthorne, or whoever was behind the foundation, had already known something was hidden in these mountains. The Panther hadn't accidentally led them here. She'd been trying to warn Elena. Try to show her what was being threatened before outsiders could claim it. Find what you needed? Martha asked, appearing beside the table. Who approved the survey request? Elena asked. Martha leaned over, squinting at the document. That'd be Judge Harrison, though between you and me, word is the foundation made a pretty generous donation to his re-election campaign right before filing. Not that anyone can prove anything. Of course. Money greasing wheels, powerful men making backroom deals while pretending to care about historical preservation. Is there a way to challenge it? Elena asked. Martha's expression turned sympathetic. You'd need a lawyer. Good one, too. The foundation's got plenty of money and plenty of friends in state government. They've been buying up mineral rights all over the county, commissioning surveys, filing claims. Some folks are calling it the new gold rush. Gold rush. The words made Elena's skin crawl. What are they looking for? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Officially, historical sites. Unofficially, Martha lowered her voice. There's been rumors for years about Spanish gold hidden in these mountains. Conquistadors who got lost, buried their treasure, never made it out. Most folks think it's just legends. But the foundation seems to think there's truth to it. Elena forced herself to keep her expression neutral. Legends usually are just legends. Usually, Martha agreed. But I'll tell you something strange. About 2 months ago, a geologist from the university came through, said he was doing mineral surveys for his research, spent 3 weeks tramping around the high country, then suddenly packed up and left. Week later, the foundation filed their first survey request. Makes you wonder what he found up there. A geologist, someone who could have detected the limestone chamber using ground-penetrating radar, someone who could have mapped the cave system and sold that information to the highest bidder. Elena gathered the copied documents, thanked Martha, and walked out into the cold November morning. Her mind was spinning, trying to piece together the timeline. 2 months ago, geologist surveys the area, possibly discovers anomalies consistent with cave systems. 6 weeks ago, Foundation begins filing survey requests, making donations to local officials. 3 weeks ago, Panther begins bringing artifacts to Elena's porch, trying to show her the chamber before it's discovered by outsiders. 3 days ago, Hawthorne visits Elena, probing for information. 2 nights ago, men with equipment searched the mountain in darkness. They were closing in, methodically, professionally, and Elena had nothing to fight that would accept a promise to a dead man and a Panther who couldn't speak in any courtroom. She needed help, but who could she trust with a secret this dangerous? The answer came as she walked past the library, a small brick building with a faded mural of the mountains painted across one wall. Through the window, she saw a familiar figure shelving books in the local history section. Sarah Chun. They'd gone to graduate school together, both specializing in southeastern archaeology, both dreaming of discoveries that would make their careers. But where Elena had chased controversial theories and crashed spectacularly, Sarah had taken the safe path, got her Ph.D., took a position as the county's only professional archivist and historical librarian, built a quiet reputation for thorough, careful research. They hadn't spoken in 5 years, not since the scandal that destroyed Elena's career. But Sarah was also the only person within 100 miles who might understand what was at stake. Elena pushed open the library door. The smell of old paper and dust wrapped around her like a familiar coat. Sarah looked up from the bookshelf, and for a moment, shock flickered across her face. Elena, I need your help, Elena said. And you're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you. Sarah's office was a cramped room in the back of the library, walls lined with filing cabinets containing centuries of county records, old photographs, handwritten journals from early settlers. A space heater hummed in the corner, fighting against a November chill seeping through the old building's walls. Sarah poured 2 cups of terrible coffee from a pot that looked older than both of them and sat down behind her desk, studying Elena with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "You disappeared," Sarah said quietly, "after everything happened. I tried calling, emailing. You never responded." "I know." Elena wrapped her hand around the coffee mug, feeling its warmth. "I couldn't face anyone from that life. It hurt too much." "I never believed the accusations," Sarah said. "For what it's worth, I knew you wouldn't fabricate evidence. You were too passionate about the truth." Elena's throat tightened. The department didn't agree. The department was covering their asses. That grad student's father donated $500,000 to build the new archaeology wing. They couldn't afford to side with you. Sarah leaned forward. "But that was 5 years ago. Why are you here now?" Elena took a breath and made a decision. She pulled out her phone, opened the photos she'd secretly taken inside the chamber before leaving. Careful shots of the artifacts, the wall carvings, the arrangement of objects. She'd promised to protect the site, but she needed Sarah to understand the stakes. "Because I found something," Elena said, sliding the phone across the desk. "And people are coming to take it away." Sarah picked up the phone, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the images. Her coffee went cold, forgotten, as she zoomed in on details, the Mississippian pottery, the Spanish gold, the petroglyphs that shouldn't exist this far north. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered. "Where is this?" "I can't tell you the exact location. Not yet, but it's on my property, and the Appalachian Heritage Foundation is trying to claim rights to survey the area. They have equipment, people, money. They're going to find it, Sarah. And when they do, they're going to tear it apart." Sarah set down the phone, her archaeologist's mind clearly racing through implications. Elena, this is a discovery of the century. This proves contact between Mississippian cultures and Spanish explorers. This validates everything you were trying to argue in your research. "I know. So why aren't you calling every museum, every university, every archaeological journal? This could restore your reputation. You'd be vindicated. Famous." Elena thought of Thomas Whitfield's letter, the Panther's trust, her grandmother's journal. Because some things are more important than being right. Sarah stared at her. "You're serious. You want to keep this hidden." "I want to protect it," Elena corrected. "There's a difference. Thomas Whitfield found this chamber in 1962 and chose to seal it again. He understood that exposing it would destroy it. Treasure hunters, looters, academic politics. Everything would descend on this site like vultures. The artifacts would end up scattered in private collections and museum storage. The sacred context would be lost. So what's your plan? Keep it secret forever? Hope no one ever finds it?" "No," Elena said. "Someone already knows, or suspects strongly enough to invest serious money in finding it. I need to figure out who told them and how much they actually know." Sarah drummed her fingers on the desk, thinking. The Heritage Foundation. I've heard about them. They're not what they claim to be. Meaning they're funded by a shell corporation based in the Caymans. I did some digging last year when they started buying mineral rights in the county. On paper, they're preservationists. In reality, they're treasure hunters with legal departments. Elena's stomach tightened. "How do you know this?" "Because I'm the county archivist. I see every property transaction, every survey request, every mineral rights transfer. And I've watched the foundation systematically acquire claims across the entire eastern ridge. They're not looking for one site. Elena, they're looking for a network, multiple caches. They think the Spanish buried gold all through these mountains." "Are they right?" Sarah gestured at the phone. "You tell me. That gold in your photos didn't appear out of nowhere." Elena pulled out the gold disc she'd kept, the one she should have returned to the chamber, but couldn't quite let go of. She set it on the desk between them. "The Panther brought me this, along with pottery shards, stone tools, Copper beads. She was trying to show me what was being threatened. The panther, Sarah repeated slowly. You're saying a wild animal was bringing you archaeological artifacts. I'm saying there's a bloodline of panthers that have been protecting that chamber for generations. Thomas Whitfield made some kind of agreement with them, and now they're trying to protect it from the foundation. Sarah picked up the gold disc, turning it over in her hands. Her skeptical expression gradually shifted to something closer to wonder. I spent 5 years in fieldwork. I've seen a lot of strange things in these mountains. Things that don't make it into academic papers because they can't be explained by rational frameworks. She set down the disc. I believe you. Relief flooded through Elena. Then will you help me? Help you do what exactly? We can't fight the foundation legally. They have resources we don't. And if they've already filed survey requests, it's only a matter of time before they're granted access. Then we need to know exactly what they know and who gave them the information. If we can prove their geologist was trespassing, conducting illegal surveys without permission, maybe we can invalidate their requests. Sarah's eyes brightened. That could work, especially if we can show they obtained information through unlawful means. There's precedent for throwing out evidence gathered during illegal surveys. She turned to her computer. Let me dig into their filing records. See if I can find the name of their surveyor. While Sarah worked, Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains rising in the distance. Somewhere up there, the panther was watching over a chamber that held the final treasures of a people who'd been pushed to the edge of extinction. And somewhere down here, powerful men were planning to tear it all apart for profit. Got him, Sarah said suddenly. Dr. Marcus Webb, geologist from State University. He filed 3 different survey reports with the Foundation over the last 2 months, all focused on limestone formations in the Eastern Ridge. Can you get copies of those reports? They're supposed to be public record, but... Sarah clicked through several screens. They've been marked confidential by the Foundation, claimed as proprietary research. Can you get them anyway? Sarah gave her a look. Are you asking me to do something illegal? I'm asking you to help me protect something that belongs to the mountain, to the people whose ancestors put it there. For a long moment, Sarah just stared at her. Then she smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile Elena remembered from their grad school days when they'd stayed up until dawn arguing about methodology and ethics and what archaeology was really for. I've been doing boring, careful, safe work for 5 years, Sarah said, cataloging other people's discoveries, filing other people's papers. I think it's time I remembered why I became an archaeologist in the first place. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Give me until tomorrow. I have a friend who works in the university's geology department. If Webb filed these surveys, he had to submit raw data to justify his conclusions. That data has to be stored somewhere, and university servers are notoriously easy to access if you know the right people. Elena felt hope kindle in her chest for the first time since Hawthorne's visit. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Even if we get the data, even if we prove they obtained it illegally, the Foundation will just find another angle. They want what's in those mountains, and they have the money and connections to take it. So what do we do? Sarah leaned back in her chair, thinking, we need to make the site legally untouchable. And the only way to do that is to get it protected before the Foundation can claim it. Protected how? State archaeological preserve status. It's rare, hard to obtain, requires extensive documentation and review. But if granted, it would put the site under permanent protection. No excavation without explicit permission from the State Preservation Board. No commercial exploitation. No private ownership of artifacts. Elena's heart raced. How long does that process take? Normally, months, sometimes years. Sarah's smile turned calculating. But we have something they don't. Photographic evidence of an intact, undisturbed site that could rewrite southeastern archaeology. If we can get those images to the right people, people who care more about preservation than profit, we might be able to fast-track an emergency protection order. Who are the right people? Dr. James Whitehorse. He's Cherokee, head of the university's Indigenous Studies program, and he sits on the State Preservation Board. He's been fighting for decades to protect sacred sites from commercial exploitation. If anyone would understand what's at stake, it's him. Elena thought about Thomas Whitfield's letter, about protecting the chamber, about honoring the trust that had been placed in her. Wouldn't going to White Horse mean revealing the location, bringing in authorities? Eventually, yes, but it would be on our terms, with protections in place. The alternative is letting the Foundation find it and claim it under archaeological salvage laws. It was a risk, a huge risk, but Sarah was right. Doing nothing meant losing everything. Okay, Elena said. Contact White Horse. But carefully. We need to know we can trust him before we show him anything. Agreed. Sarah closed her laptop. In the meantime, you should prepare yourself. If we're to fight this, things are going to get ugly. The Foundation has a reputation for playing dirty when someone gets in their way. As if summoning proof of Sarah's words, Elena's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Dr. Marsh. We know you visited the county clerk's office. We know you're gathering information about our surveys. This doesn't have to be adversarial. The offer of compensation still stands. But our patience is limited. All right, Elena showed the message to Sarah, whose expression darkened. They're watching you, Sarah said quietly. Probably have been since Hawthorne's first visit. Let them watch, Elena said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. They're going to learn that some things aren't for sale. But as she drove back up the mountain that afternoon, passing logging roads and hiking trails that could hide a dozen surveillance points, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was being hunted. The Panther was waiting when she reached the cabin, sitting on the porch railing in the fading light. Her golden eyes tracked Elena's approach, and something in her posture seemed tense, alert. They're not giving up, Elena told her. We're going to have to fight. The Panther's tail lashed once. Then she jumped down from the railing and walked to the edge of the clearing, looking back at Elena with clear intention. You want to show me something else? The Panther chuffed, an affirmative sound Elena had learned to recognize. Against her better judgment, exhausted from a day of research and revelation, Elena followed the great cat into the darkening forest. They didn't go toward the chamber this time. Instead, the Panther led her along the ridge to a rocky outcropping that overlooked the entire valley. And there, carved into the stone where the setting sun hit it perfectly, were symbols. Not Mississippian, not Spanish. Older, much older. Petroglyphs that had weathered centuries of rain and snow, but were still visible in the golden light. Spirals, concentric circles, and a symbol Elena recognized from her research, a panther with a sun disk above its head, a guardian figure. Sacred, ancient. The panther sat beside the carving, her profile matching the stone image almost perfectly. Then she turned to look at Elena, and the message was unmistakable. This is older than conquistadors, older than the Yuchi, older than any history you know, and it has been guarded for all of it. Elena sank to her knees beside the petroglyphs, hands trembling as she traced the weathered lines. This changed everything. This wasn't just about Spanish gold or indigenous artifacts. This was about a sacred site that had been protected for potentially thousands of years, and she was now part of that protection. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire. The panther remained motionless beside her, a living connection to an unbroken chain of guardians stretching back into deep time. Below them, in the valley, lights began to flicker on. Human lives, human concerns, human greed. None of them knowing what slept in the mountains above their heads. None of them understanding the weight of responsibility that came with knowing. Elena's phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Sarah. Got web survey data. You need to see this. He found more than one chamber. Meet me tomorrow morning. And Elena, be careful. This is bigger than we thought. Elena looked at the panther, then back at the ancient petroglyphs glowing in the last light. How many chambers are there? She whispered. The panther's only answer was to stand and walk back toward the forest, leaving Elena alone with the weight of secrets that were multiplying like shadows in the growing dark. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible mountain stories like this one. Sarah's hand shook as she spread the printed survey data across the library's back table. Dawn light filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across geological maps marked with coordinates, elevation profiles, and radar imaging that looked like abstract art until you understood what you were seeing. 5 chambers, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Webb found evidence of 5 separate cave systems, all within a 3-mile radius of your property, all showing identical signatures. Limestone formations with human-made alterations, metal deposits consistent with gold and copper, and organic material that could be preserved artifacts. Elena stared at the maps, her coffee growing cold in her hands. 5 chambers. Not just the one the Panther had shown her. An entire network of sacred vaults, hidden across the mountain like a constellation of secrets. How is this possible? Elena breathed. How did no one find these before? Because they weren't looking, Sarah replied. Or they were looking in the wrong places. Webb's survey focused on areas where previous geological studies had noted anomalies, irregular cave formations, unusual mineral deposits. Most researchers dismissed them as natural variations. But Webb had access to new ground-penetrating radar technology that can see deeper, map more precisely. She pulled out another sheet, this one covered in handwritten notes. And here's where it gets interesting. These aren't Webb's notes. They're from someone else, someone who surveyed this area in 1961. Elena's heart stopped. Thomas Whitfield. I found these in the county archives, buried in a box of old Forest Service documents. Whitfield was working as a surveyor for the lumber company, and he kept meticulous records. Look. Sarah pointed to a hand-drawn map, yellow with age but still legible. He marked all 5 locations, numbered them, and next to each one he wrote the same thing. Guardian present. Do not disturb. The room seemed to tilt. Thomas had known about all of them. He'd documented their locations, then deliberately hidden that information, and he'd left clues, breadcrumbs scattered across decades, for someone who might someday need to protect them. Guardian present, Elena repeated softly. The Panther bloodline. They've been protecting all 5 sites. Sarah nodded slowly, which means the Foundation isn't just after one treasure. They're planning to excavate the entire network. Strip mine these mountains for every artifact, every piece of gold, every scrap of historical evidence. We can't let that happen. Agreed, but here's our problem. Sarah pulled up a legal document on her laptop. The Foundation filed a motion yesterday with the State Archaeological Board. They're claiming urgent need to excavate based on credible evidence of significant historical sites at risk of natural deterioration. They're requesting an emergency permit that would allow them to begin work within 30 days. 30 days. Less than a month to stop them. Elena's mind raced through options, each one more desperate than the last. What about Whitehorse? Have you reached out to him? I sent him an email last night with some of your photos. He responded an hour ago. Sarah's expression was grim. He wants to meet. Today. In person. And Elena, he's not coming alone. He's bringing someone from the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians Tribal Preservation Office. Fear and hope warred in Elena's chest. That could be good. If the tribal nations claim ancestral connection to these sites, it could also backfire spectacularly, Sarah interrupted. If they decide the sites should be excavated under indigenous oversight rather than left sealed, we lose our argument for preservation. And if the Foundation finds out we've contacted tribal authorities, they'll accelerate their timeline. So what do? Sarah closed her laptop with deliberate care. We tell the truth. We show them everything. Thomas's maps, your photos, the Panther's role in protecting the sites. And we trust that people who actually care about sacred preservation will make the right choice. Elena thought of the chamber, the ancient petroglyphs, the Panther's golden eyes watching her with millennia of trust. When and where? Noon. The old fire lookout tower on Raven's Peak. Neutral ground, away from town, away from prying eyes. The drive to Raven's Peak took Elena through memories she'd tried to forget. Past the turnoff to the university, where she'd once taught. past the coffee shop where her ex-husband had told her he was leaving because he couldn't watch her destroy herself over pointless theories, past the courthouse where she'd sign away everything she'd built in exchange for a clean break in silence. The mountains rose around her like guardians of their own, indifferent to human drama, eternal in their patience. She'd come here to hide from failure. Instead, she'd been handed a responsibility that made her old academic battles seem petty and small. The Fire Lookout Tower stood on the highest peak in the county, a wooden structure from the 1930s that had been abandoned when the Forest Service went digital. Now it served as a landmark for hikers and a meeting place for people who value privacy. 2 vehicles were already parked at the trailhead when Elena arrived, Sarah's aging Subaru and a newer truck with Cherokee Nation plates. Her stomach clenched. The climb to the tower took 15 minutes, boots crunching through frost-hardened leaves, breath forming clouds in the November air. At the top, 3 people waited on the tower's observation deck. Sarah stood with a tall man in his 60s, silver hair worn long, dressed in practical hiking gear, but carried himself with quiet authority. Dr. James Whitehorse, Elena presumed. Beside him stood a younger woman, maybe 30, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a messenger bag covered in patches from various indigenous rights organizations. Dr. Marsh, Whitehorse said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, his gaze measuring. Sarah speaks highly of you. This is Angela Swimmer, preservation officer for the Eastern Band. Angela's handshake was equally firm. Dr. Marsh. Or, do you prefer Elena? Elena's fine. I'm not using the title much these days. Sarah told us what happened to your career. Angela said, academic politics destroying good research because it threatens comfortable narratives. We see it all the time. Her expression hardened, especially when that research involves indigenous history that doesn't fit colonial frameworks. Elena felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. These were people who understood, who'd fought similar battles. Thank you for meeting with us, she said. I know this is unusual. Unusual is an understatement, Whitehorse interrupted, but his tone was kind. Sarah showed us photographs of artifacts that shouldn't exist in this region, told us about a panther guarding sacred sites, mentioned a network of chambers that could rewrite our understanding of pre-contact cultural exchange. He smiled slightly. I've been doing this work for 40 years. I thought I'd heard every variation of treasure hunter's fantasy and well-meaning amateur's delusion, but these photographs... He trailed off, shaking his head. These are real. They are, Elena confirmed, and the Appalachian Heritage Foundation is planning to excavate them within 30 days, unless we can stop them. Angela pulled a tablet from her bag, swiping through screens. We've been tracking the foundation for the last year. They've filed excavation permits in 6 different states, always targeting areas with legends of hidden Spanish gold. They present themselves as preservationists, but their funding comes from private collectors. Artifacts they preserve have a habit of disappearing into personal collections. So you know what they really are, Sarah said. Grave robbers with lawyers, Angela replied bluntly. But knowing what they are and stopping them legally are different things. They operate in gray areas, exploit loopholes, make generous donations to the right officials. She looked at Elena. To fight them, we need irrefutable evidence that these sites have sacred significance beyond commercial value. We need to prove indigenous connection, cultural continuity, ongoing spiritual importance. Elena pulled out her phone, navigating to the photos she'd taken of the petroglyphs the Panther had shown her. Would these help? Whitehorse took the phone, and his breath caught. He zoomed in on the image, studying the spiral patterns, the guardian figure, the astronomical alignments carved into ancient stone. His hands began to shake. Where? He whispered. Where'd you find these? On my property. The Panther led me there yesterday. They're not documented anywhere that I know of. Thomas Whitfield never mentioned them in his surveys. Because he was protecting them, Whitehorse said, voice thick with emotion. These symbols, they're not Mississippian, not Yuchi. They're older, much older, pre-pottery archaic period, possibly 4,000 to 5,000 years old. He looked up at Elena, eyes bright. Do you understand what this means? These petroglyphs prove continuous indigenous presence in these mountains for millennia. They established this area as a sacred landscape long before European contact. Angela was already typing on her tablet. If we can document these petroglyphs, if we can establish their age and cultural significance, we can file for emergency protection under the National Historic Preservation Act and the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, both federal laws that supersede state permits. But that would require revealing the location, Elena said, bringing in archaeologists, documentation teams, possibly media attention. Everything Thomas Whitfield was trying to avoid. Thomas Whitfield was working 60 years ago. Whitehorse said gently, "Times have changed. We have legal protections now that didn't exist then. We have indigenous voices in preservation decisions. We have frameworks for protecting sacred sites while still allowing them to be studied respectfully by the right people with community oversight. Or," Angela added, "we keep them secret. The Foundation finds them anyway, and they're excavated by treasure hunters who will scatter the artifacts to the highest bidders. Those are our options." Elena walked to the tower's railing, looking out at the mountains stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, 5 chambers held the accumulated treasures of people who trusted the mountain to keep them safe. And now she had to decide whether safety meant continued secrecy or strategic revelation. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "The Panther. She's real. Not metaphorical, not symbolic. An actual black panther who has been actively guarding these sites. She led me to the first chamber. She's been bringing me artifacts as warnings. She showed me the petroglyphs. Thomas Whitfield wrote about a guardian. I think this bloodline of panthers has been protecting these places for generations." Silence stretched across the observation deck. Elena didn't turn around, couldn't bear to see skepticism or pity in their faces. Finally, Whitehorse spoke. "The Cherokee have stories, old stories, from before the Trail of Tears, about the Tlanua, great spirit animals who guarded sacred places. Panthers were among them, protectors of hidden knowledge, keepers of the boundary between worlds." His voice was thoughtful, not dismissive. "Most people think they're just legends, but legends often preserve truths that more recent history has forgotten." Elena turned back to face them. "You believe me? I believe the mountains hold mysteries that can't be explained by conventional frameworks," Whitehorse said. "And I believe that if a panther has chosen to reveal these sites to you, we should honor that choice by protecting what she's been guarding." Relief flooded through Elena, so powerfully her knees weakened. "So, what do we do?" Angela's fingers flew across her tablet. "We file an emergency petition with the Federal Preservation Board. Today, we include your photographs, Thomas Whitfield's historical documentation, and a formal request from the Eastern Band to survey the sites for cultural affiliation. That should freeze any state permits while the federal review process plays out." "How long will that take?" Sarah asked. "Months, minimum, but it buys us time." Angela looked up from her screen. "However, we need to be prepared for the Foundation to fight back. They have resources. They'll challenge a petition, demand access, possibly file suit claiming you're interfering with legitimate research." "Let them," Elena said, surprised by the steel in her voice. "I'd rather fight them in court than watch them destroy what's been protected for thousands of years." Whitehorse smiled. "Thomas Whitfield chose his heir well." "I'm not his heir," Elena protested. "I'm just the person who happened to be here when the Panther needed help." "That's what an heir is," Whitehorse said. "Someone who accepts responsibility they didn't ask for because it's the right thing to do." The petition was filed by 5 p.m. that afternoon. By 7 p.m., Elena received a phone call from Robert Hawthorne. She let go to voicemail. His message was clipped, barely containing fury. "Dr. Marsh, I see you've chosen to make this adversarial. That's unfortunate. The Foundation has significant resources and significant patience, but both are finite. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position before you find yourself facing legal consequences you can't afford." Sarah, who was sitting at Elena's kitchen table helping her organize documentation, looked up. "Consequences he can't specify because they're probably illegal?" "Probably." Elena deleted the message. But he's right about one thing. They have resources we don't. Money, lawyers, connections. We have the law, Sarah said, and we have the truth. The truth didn't help me 5 years ago when I had evidence that contradicted the wrong people's interests. This is different. You're not alone this time. A knock at the door made them both jump. Elena reached for the rifle prop beside the fireplace, then forced herself to relax. If the Foundation wanted to threaten her physically, they wouldn't knock. She opened the door to find Angela Swimmer standing on the porch, backpack slung over one shoulder, looking exhausted but determined. "I need to see them," Angela said without preamble. "The chambers, the petroglyphs, all of it. Before we go further with the legal fight, I need to document everything with my own eyes." Elena's first instinct was to refuse. Bringing someone to the sites meant revealing their locations, breaking the secrecy that had protected them for decades. But Angela continued, "I understand your hesitation, but I'm asking not as a government official or an academic. I'm asking as someone whose ancestors were driven from these mountains 200 years ago. If there's evidence of our people here, evidence of what was taken from us, I need to see it. I need to know." The raw honesty in her voice decided it. Elena grabbed her coat. "We go now while there's still light, and we don't tell anyone where we're going." "Agreed." Sarah stood. "I'm coming too." "No," Elena said firmly. "Someone needs to stay here in case the Foundation sends more people. And someone needs to be ready to call for help if we don't come back." Sarah wanted to argue. Elena could see in her face. But she nodded. "Be careful, both of you." Elena led Angela into the forest, following the path the Panther had shown her. The November woods were quiet. Most birds already gone south, leaves fallen and frost brittle underfoot. Every sound seemed magnified. Their breathing, their footsteps, the distant call of a raven. They'd been walking for 20 minutes when Angela stopped abruptly. "We're being followed." Elena's hand went to the knife at her belt. "How do you know?" "Training. And instinct." Angela's eyes scanned the trees. "Something's pacing us. Parallel to our route, maybe 30 yards out." Elena's fear transformed into understanding. "The Panther. She's making sure you're trustworthy." Angela's eyebrows rose. "The Guardian. She's been watching over these sites for." Elena stopped, searching for words. "I don't know how long, but she trusts me, and she needs to decide if she trusts you." They continued walking, and Elena felt the presence tracking them, not threatening but evaluating, judging. When they reached the limestone cliff with its hidden entrance, Elena paused. "Before we go in," she said, "you need to understand something. What you're about to see can't be unseen, can't be unknown. Once you have this knowledge, you become responsible for protecting it, for the rest of your life." Angela met her eyes steadily. "I understand, and I accept that responsibility." Elena pulled aside the vines, concealing the entrance. "Then follow me." The passage felt narrower than before, or maybe it was a way to bringing another person into the secret. They squeezed through stone, emerged into the chamber, and Elena clicked on her flashlight. Angela's gasp echoed off the ancient walls. The beam illuminated the treasures exactly as Elena had left them. Pottery arranged by size and type, stone tools in careful rows, copper ornaments hanging from natural hooks, and scattered throughout like fallen stars, gold. Spanish colonial pieces mixed with indigenous work. Proof of contact and conflict and survival. But it was the wall carvings that held Angela transfixed. She approached them slowly, reverently, her fingers hovering just above the carved symbols without touching. "These spirals," she whispered, "they're identical to carvings we have documented in North Carolina and Tennessee, sites we know were sacred to the Cherokee and our ancestors. This proves connection across hundreds of miles. Proves these weren't isolated villages, but part of a vast cultural network." She turned to Elena, tears streaming down her face. "Do you know what this means? Every time we try to establish historical presence in these mountains, we're told there's insufficient evidence, that our oral histories aren't enough, that we can't prove continuous occupation." She gestured at the chamber. "This is proof, undeniable, physical, archaeological proof that our people were here. that we maintained sacred sites here, that we had sophisticated cultural practices here long before Europeans arrived claiming Terra Nullius. Empty land. Elena felt her own throat tighten. Thomas Whitfield understood. That's why he protected it. Because the wrong people finding this would mean it being used to justify extraction rather than preservation. He was right. Angela pulled out her camera, beginning to document methodically. But times have changed. Now we have legal frameworks to protect sites like this, to ensure they're studied by indigenous scholars, preserved according to cultural protocols, kept safe from commercial exploitation. A sound from the chamber entrance made them both freeze, not the scrape of boots on stone. Something softer, the padding of paws. The Panther emerged from the passage, her black coat seeming to absorb the flashlight beam, golden eyes fixed on Angela with unblinking intensity. Angela went perfectly still. "Elena, don't move," Elena whispered. "Let her approach you." The Panther circled Angela slowly, scenting her, evaluating. Then she did something that made Elena's heart skip. She walked directly to Angela and pressed her massive head against the woman's thigh. Angela's breath hitched, but she didn't move away. Slowly, carefully, she lowered one hand to rest on the Panther's head. The great cat rumbled, a sound too deep to be called a purr, more like the mountain itself vibrating with approval. "She's accepting you," Elena breathed. "She's saying you're worthy of the trust." Tears continued streaming down Angela's face as she stood there, one hand on the ancient guardian, surrounded by treasures that proved her people's history. "Thank you," she whispered. Whether to Elena or the Panther or the mountain itself, Elena wasn't sure. The Panther pulled away, turned to Elena, and made a soft chuffing sound. Then she walked to the far wall of the chamber and pawed at a section of stone that looked no different from any other. "What is she?" Angela started to ask. Elena approached, running her hands over the stone. "There's an air current, another passage." She pushed, and a section of wall that had seemed solid shifted slightly. Behind it, darkness and the smell of deeper earth. The other chambers, Elena realized, they are connected, an entire underground network. The Panther looked back at them, tail swishing. The invitation was clear. Elena and Angela exchanged glances. They'd come this far. There was no turning back now. They followed the Panther into passages that wound to the mountain's heart, connecting chambers like pearls on a string. Each one held its own treasures. The second chamber was filled with burial goods, ceramic vessels still containing offerings, stone effigy pipes, shell necklaces arranged around empty spaces where bodies had once rested before being moved to safer ground. The third chamber held weapons, spear points, stone axes, copper blades, arranged as if for an army that would someday return. The fourth held what could only be astronomical records, rocks arranged in patterns that mirrored star positions, carved calendar stones marking solstices and equinoxes. And the fifth chamber, the deepest, held something that made both women stop breathing. Gold, not scattered pieces, but a pile that glowed in the flashlight beam like a fallen sun. Spanish coins, jewelry, religious items, plate armor pieces melted down and recast. And surrounding it all, carved into every wall, were scenes of battle, conquest, resistance. Indigenous warriors fighting Spanish soldiers, villages burning, people fleeing into the mountains, and finally, a scene of burial, of taking conquistadors' gold and transforming it into something sacred, hiding it where it could never again be used to fund genocide. "This is their final statement," Angela said, voice shaking. They took the weapons of their oppressors and turned them into a memorial, a promise that the mountain would remember what was done to them, even if the world forgot. Elena photographed everything, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were documenting. This wasn't just archaeological evidence. This was testimony, a witness statement from people who'd been systematically erased from official histories. The Panther watched them work, patient and eternal, as she probably watched Thomas Whitfield document these same chambers 60 years earlier. As her ancestors had probably watched the last Yuchi survivors seal these treasures away in the 1560s. When they finally emerged from the mountain, night had fallen completely. Stars blazed overhead in the clear November sky, the same stars that had guided the people who created these chambers. Angela turned to Elena. "We can't let the Foundation touch this. Ever." "I know. No. I mean, we need to go beyond legal protection. We need to bury this so deep in federal and tribal protections that it would take an act of Congress to excavate. We need to make sure that if these chambers are ever studied, it's by indigenous scholars, on indigenous terms, with indigenous oversight at every step. Can we do that?" Angela's smile was fierce. "Watch us. The Eastern Band has been fighting for our rights for 200 years. We know how to protect what's sacred." The next week passed in a blur of legal filings, documentation, and quiet preparation for the battle everyone knew was coming. White Horse connected them with a lawyer who specialized in indigenous preservation cases. Sarah compiled a comprehensive archive of Thomas Whitfield's historical documentation. Angela coordinated with other tribal nations, building a coalition of voices demanding protection for the sites. And Elena returned to the chambers every night with a Panther, photographing, measuring, documenting everything with meticulous care. Not for publication, not for glory, but for the record, so that if the worst happened, if the Foundation somehow won, at least there would be evidence of what was destroyed. On the 8th day, the Foundation's response arrived. It came as a legal filing, a motion to dismiss the federal petition, arguing that Elena had no standing to claim indigenous affiliation, that the Eastern Band had no proof of ancestral connection to the sites, and that the alleged artifacts were likely misidentified natural formations or modern fabrications. "They're calling me a fraud again," Elena said, reading the document in Sarah's library office. "Different venue, same accusations. Except this time you have proof," Sarah said. "Documentation from multiple sources. Testimony from recognized experts. Physical evidence they can't dismiss. They're going to demand site access," Angela said, reading over Elena's shoulder. "Look at paragraph 12. They're petitioning the court to order an immediate inspection by qualified neutral archaeologists to verify the site's existence and significance." Elena's stomach churned. "If the court grants that, then we'd be forced to reveal the locations and allow Foundation-approved archaeologists to examine the chambers," Angela finished. "Which means they get exactly what they want. Access to the sites and documentation of everything inside. Can we fight it? We're going to try. But..." Angela hesitated. "Elena, you need to prepare yourself for possibility that we might lose this round. Courts tend to favor access and verification over preservation and secrecy. If the judge rules that the Foundation has legitimate research interests, we might be ordered to disclose." The thought of Robert Hawthorne and his hired archaeologists descending on the chambers made Elena physically ill. But another thought scared her more. What if we lose in court and the Foundation excavates anyway? What if all of this, all the documentation, all the legal protections we're building, what if it's not enough? White Horse, who'd been listening quietly from his seat by the window, finally spoke. "Then we make sure the story gets told anyway. We go public. Full media exposure. Document everything, publish everything. Make so much noise that the Foundation can't operate in shadows anymore." "That's exactly what Thomas Whitfield was trying to avoid," Elena protested. Thomas Whitfield was protecting sites from an era when indigenous voices had no power, when grave robbers operated openly, when academic institutions displayed stolen remains like trophies. White Horse's voice was firm. "We live in different times now. Not perfect times, far from it, but times when we can fight back, when we can demand our sacred sites be treated with respect, when we can force accountability." His words settled something in Elena's chest. She'd been so focused on keeping the secret that she'd forgotten there might be power in revealing it, on their terms, in their timing, with their narrative. "If we're going to go public," she said slowly, "we need to do it right. We need to control the story before the Foundation can spin it." Angela was already typing on her tablet. "I have contacts at indigenous media outlets, journalists who understand cultural sensitivity, who'll tell this story with the respect it deserves. And I can reach out to the academic archaeology community," Sarah added. "There are people who will be horrified at the Foundation's tactics, who will support preservation over excavation." "We move fast," White Horse said. Release the story simultaneously across multiple platforms. Make it impossible for the Foundation to suppress or control the narrative. And we frame it not as treasure discovery, but as sacred site protection, as indigenous resistance to continued colonial extraction. Elena looked at each of them, these people who become allies, partners, protectors of something bigger than any of them, when, tomorrow, Angela said, before the court hearing, before the Foundation knows what's coming. The story broke at dawn. Indigenous news outlets led with it. Sacred Cherokee sites threatened by treasure hunters. The accompanying photographs, carefully selected to show artifacts and petroglyphs without revealing exact locations, went viral within hours. By noon, mainstream media picked it up. National news networks ran segments on the battle over Appalachian gold. Academic journals issued statements condemning commercial exploitation of archaeological resources. Social media erupted with debates about indigenous rights, preservation ethics, and whether anything should remain secret in the age of information. And in the eye of the storm, Elena sat in the county courthouse, waiting for the hearing that would determine everything. The courtroom was packed. Foundation lawyers in expensive suits occupied one table. Elena, Angela, and their pro bono attorney sat the other. The gallery was filled with reporters, tribal representatives, local residents, and various interested parties who'd driven from across the state. Judge Margaret Harrison, the same judge who approved the Foundation's original survey request, entered, and everyone rose. She was a woman in her 70s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for running an efficient courtroom. "Be seated," she said, settling into her chair. "I've reviewed the filings from both parties. I've also spent the morning reading news articles, watching social media discussions, and fielding calls from various government officials who suddenly care very much about what happens in this courtroom." Her tone was dry. "So before we proceed, let me be clear. I don't care about public opinion. I don't care about media narratives. I care about the law. Mr. Caldwell, you're representing the Foundation." A man in a charcoal suit stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Marcus Caldwell for the Appalachian Heritage Foundation. And Ms. Nez, you're representing Dr. Marsh and the Eastern Band?" A small native woman with iron gray hair and eyes like flint stood. "Di Nez, Your Honor. And yes, we're representing both Dr. Marsh's property interests and the Eastern Band's cultural preservation concerns." "Then let's begin. Mr. Caldwell, your motion demands immediate site access. On what grounds?" Caldwell launched into his argument. The Foundation had legitimate research interests. The sites were of significant historical importance. The federal petition was based on unverified claims, and denying access would impede valuable scientific inquiry. He spoke well, Elena thought, persuasively, making it sound like they were the reasonable ones, just trying to preserve history, while Elena and her allies were paranoid obstructionists hiding evidence. When he finished, Judge Harrison turned to Dine Nez. "Your response." Nez stood slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations. "Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about who has the right to control sacred indigenous sites. The Foundation claims legitimate research interests, but their funding comes from private collectors who profit from artifact sales. They claim to preserve history, but they have a documented pattern of preserving items directly into private collections." She pulled out a folder. "I have here evidence of 15 cases in which artifacts documented by Foundation archaeologists subsequently appeared in private auctions. 15 instances of grave goods, ceremonial objects, and cultural property being transformed from protected archaeological resources into commercial commodities." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Caldwell's expression didn't change, but Elena saw his jaw tighten. "Furthermore," Nez continued, "these sites represent sacred spaces to indigenous peoples. Under the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, we have the right to protect such sites from disturbance. The petroglyphs Dr. Marsh documented, which are now publicly verified by 3 independent experts, establish clear cultural affiliation between these sites and contemporary tribal nations. But how can we verify any of this without site access?" Judge Harrison asked, "You're asking me to grant protection to sites based on photographs and historical documents. How do I know these claims are accurate?" "Because, Your Honor, We have a witness who can testify to the site's existence and significance. Someone with unimpeachable credibility and no financial stake in this case. Nez turned toward the courtroom doors. They opened, and an elderly man walked in, leaning on a cane, moving slowly but with quiet dignity. Elena's heart stopped. She knew that face. She'd seen it in old photographs at her grandmother's house. Seen it in family albums, young and smiling, before time and secrets had carved lines into weathered skin. Marcus Webb, the geologist who'd surveyed the area for the foundation, the man whose data had started this entire battle. He walked to the witness stand, was sworn in, and sat down with the careful movements of someone who'd made a difficult decision and was seeing it through. Judge Harrison frowned. "Dr. Webb, I'm confused. Aren't you working for the foundation?" "I was," Webb said, his voice raspy with age. "Until 2 days ago, when I saw news coverage of this case and realized what the foundation was planning to do with my research." "Which is?" Webb looked directly at Robert Hawthorne, who sat in the gallery, his face a mask of controlled fury. "When I conducted those surveys, I was told it was for historical preservation, for academic research. I found evidence of cave systems containing artifacts, and I reported that information in good faith, believing it would be used to protect those sites. And instead, I learned the foundation was planning immediate excavation, commercial exploitation. They were going to strip those chambers of every artifact and sell them to the highest bidders." Webb's hands shook on his cane. "I'm 73 years old, Your Honor. I've spent my career studying this land, these mountains, and I will not have my work used to destroy what I was trying to protect." The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison's gavel cracked like gunfire. "Order. I will have order." When the room quieted, she fixed Webb with a hard stare. "This is quite a reversal, Dr. Webb. Why should I believe you weren't aware of the Foundation's intentions from the beginning?" "Because I have proof." Webb reached into his coat and pulled out a flash drive. Email correspondence between Foundation leadership discussing artifact valuation, buyer contacts, and methods for bypassing federal protection laws. "I've been copying files for the last month, ever since I started suspecting their true intentions." He held up the drive. "It's all here, Your Honor. Every email, every financial transaction, every conversation proving the Foundation is not a preservation organization, but a commercial treasure hunting operation using archaeological credentials as cover." Caldwell shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." Dr. Webb signed confidentiality agreements. "This information was obtained through working for your organization and having the conscience to expose illegal activity?" Judge Harrison's tone could have frozen water. "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell." She turned to her bailiff. "Enter Dr. Webb's testimony and evidence into the record. And someone get me representatives from the State Attorney General's office. If what Dr. Webb is saying is accurate, we're looking at potential criminal violations of federal antiquities laws." Elena watched it unfold with a sense of unreality. They'd been preparing for a battle, for months of legal wrangling, for the possibility of losing everything. Instead, victory was arriving in the form of an elderly geologist with a guilty conscience and a flash drive full of damning evidence. Judge Harrison spent the next hour reviewing files on her computer, her expression growing progressively darker. Finally, she looked up. "I'm issuing an emergency order freezing all Foundation activities in this county, pending criminal investigation. I'm also granting the federal preservation petition and placing the sites under immediate protection. No excavation, no surveys, no access without explicit written permission from federal authorities and affiliated tribal nations." She turned to Caldwell. "Tell your clients that if they have any artifacts from these mountains already in their possession, they have 72 hours to surrender them to federal authorities. Failure to comply will result in prosecution for trafficking in stolen cultural property." Caldwell looked like he'd been struck. "Your Honor, we're done here. Court adjourned." The gavel fell. Elena sat frozen as chaos erupted around her. Reporters shouted questions. Foundation representatives rushed out, probably to call lawyers. Tribal elders embraced, some crying. Sarah grabbed her hand and squeezed hard enough to hurt. "We won," Sarah whispered. "Elena, we actually won." But Elena was watching Marcus Webb, who'd stood slowly and was making his way out of the courtroom. She caught up to him in the hallway. "Dr. Webb, why? Why help us?" He turned to her with tired eyes. "Because 62 years ago, a young man named Thomas Whitfield showed me something in these mountains. Something sacred that he'd sworn to protect. And he made me promise that if I ever found evidence of similar sites, I'd do the same." Elena's breath caught. "You knew Thomas?" "We worked for the same lumber company. I was just a kid, fresh out of school, arrogant as hell. Thomas was older, wiser. He taught me to see these mountains not as resources to extract, but as sacred spaces to respect." Webb smiled sadly. "When the Foundation hired me, I thought it was my chance to finally document what Thomas had protected, to prove he'd been right all along. Instead, I nearly destroyed everything he'd worked for." "You didn't," Elena said firmly. "You stopped them. You chose to do the right thing. Better late than never, I suppose." He patted her shoulder. "Thomas would be proud of you. Protecting what he loved. Standing up to people with more money and power. That takes the kind of courage that can't be bought." He walked away, leaving Elena standing in the courthouse hallway, feeling the weight of continuity, of being part of a chain of protection stretching across generations, from Thomas to Webb to her, each one making choices that mattered. The sun was setting when Elena finally returned to her cabin, exhausted and overwhelmed and more hopeful than she'd felt in years. The Panther was waiting on the porch, as she'd known she would be. Elena sat down beside her, and the great cat pressed against her side, warm and solid and real. "We did it," Elena whispered. "The chambers are protected. The foundation is finished. Your guardianship worked." The Panther rumbled, a sound of satisfaction and relief. They sat together as darkness claimed the mountain's woman and wild creature, both knowing that the battle wasn't truly over. There would be appeals, legal challenges, continued threats. But for now, for this moment, the mountain secrets were safe. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning, Elena led a small group up the mountain to the petroglyphs. The group consisted of Angela Swimmer, Dr. Whitehorse, 3 Cherokee elders, and 2 carefully vetted archaeologists who'd been granted permission to document the site under strict tribal oversight. The Panther watched in the trees, unseen by everyone except Elena, who'd learned to recognize her presence like a familiar weight. The documentation took 3 weeks. They worked slowly, respectfully, recording everything without disturbing anything. The chambers remained sealed except for one, the one with the petroglyphs, which was carefully preserved and monitored. The artifacts stayed where they'd been placed centuries ago. The gold remained buried, transformed from conquistador wealth into indigenous memorial. And the truth of what had happened in these mountains, of resistance, survival, and sacred protection, was finally told to the world. Not as treasure story, not as academic discovery, as testament. Elena's reputation was restored, though she found she cared less about that than she'd expected. She was offered positions at 3 universities, all of which she declined. Instead, she stayed in the mountains, working as a consultant for the Eastern Band's Preservation Office, helping to identify and protect other sacred sites before they could be threatened. Sarah joined her, leaving her library position to become the project's lead researcher and archivist. Together, they built something Thomas Whitfield would have recognized, a network protection of people choosing to guard rather than exploit, to preserve rather than profit. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the mountain wind whispered through pines, Elena would sit on her porch and watch the Panther emerge from the forest. The great cat would approach, press her head against Elena's hand, and purr with a sound like the mountain itself expressing contentment. The chambers remained hidden, known only to those who needed to know, protected by law and tradition, and the unbroken line of guardians who'd kept faith across millennia. Some secrets, Elena had learned, weren't meant to be exposed. They were meant to be honored. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very worthy, the mountain would choose you to help keep them. The threat arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, nearly a year after court victory. Elena was in her garden, hands deep in soil, harvesting tomatoes that had grown fat and sweet in the mountain summer. The Panther dozed in a patch of sun nearby, her once-injured leg now completely healed. Her presence as natural to the homestead as the creek's constant murmur or the wind through the pines. She'd been coming more frequently lately, sometimes staying for days at a time. Elena had stopped questioning it. The boundary between wild and domestic, between animal instinct and something approaching partnership, had blurred into irrelevance. They were what they were, guardian and guardian, sharing responsibility for something bigger than either of them. Sarah's truck rumbled up the access road, moving too fast, throwing gravel. The Panthers had lifted, ears swiveling. Elena stood, wiping dirt from her hands, already knowing something was wrong. Sarah jumped out before the engine fully stopped, waving a manila envelope. "We have a problem." Inside the cabin, spread across Elena's kitchen table, were documents that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. "New Heritage Foundation," Sarah said, pointing to the letterhead. "Different name, same players. They filed incorporation papers in Delaware 3 months ago. Started buying property options in the county 6 weeks ago. And yesterday," she pulled out a survey map, "they purchased mineral rights to 1,200 acres directly adjacent to your property line." Elena studied the map, tracing boundaries with her finger. The purchased land formed a horseshoe around her property, leaving her isolated in the center like an island. "They can't access the chambers from there. The entrances are all on my land." "That's what I thought too, until I found this." Sarah unfolded a geological survey, this one dated just 2 weeks ago. They hired a different surveying company, used new ground-penetrating radar technology. Apparently, it can map subsurface features from greater distances with higher accuracy. And look what they found. The survey showed the underground network Elena and Angela had documented, but with something new: a 6-chamber, larger than all the others, located directly beneath the property line, accessible from either side. A 6-chamber, Elena breathed. Thomas never mentioned the 6. Maybe he never found it. Or maybe... Sarah hesitated. Maybe it's something different. Look at the depth. It's deeper than the others by at least 50 feet. And the radar signature shows massive metal deposits. Elena, if this is accurate, there could be tons of artifacts down there. Maybe the main repository, with the other 5 chambers serving as satellite caches. The Panther had followed them inside and now sat beside the table, golden eyes fixed on the survey map, as if she could read its implications. "They're going to try to access it from their side," Elena said. "Claim they're conducting legal excavation on property they own." "Exactly. And because the chamber extends under your property too, they'll argue you're interfering with their legal rights if you try to stop them." Sarah slumped into a chair. "We won the last battle, but they've learned. They're using the legal system more carefully this time. No overt treasure hunting, no fraudulent preservation claims. Just property rights and mineral extraction. What about the federal protections? The tribal oversight only applies to known sites on protected land. This chamber isn't documented in any of our filings because we didn't know it existed. And the New Heritage Foundation can argue they're simply exercising mineral rights they legally purchased." Elena walked to the window, looking out at mountains that suddenly felt less like sanctuary and more like contested ground. A year ago, she thought protecting the chambers would be a single battle. Win the court case, secure the protections, ensure the guardianship continued. She'd been naive. "There's more," Sarah said quietly. "I did some digging into the New Heritage Foundation's ownership structure. Guess who's listed as a silent partner? Hawthorne. His brother-in-law. Actually, Robert Hawthorne himself kept clear of it legally. But the money trail leads back to the same investors who funded the original foundation. They just restructured, waited for the media attention to die down, and regrouped." The Panther made a low sound, not quite a growl, but close. A warning. Elena turned back to the table, studying the survey with new urgency. "When do they plan to start excavation?" "That's the worst part. They already have. Applied for and received a commercial mining permit last week. Broke ground 3 days ago on what they're calling an exploratory shaft on the eastern boundary of their property." 3 days? How did we not know about this? because they filed all the paperwork through a subsidiary company under different project names. I only found out because Martha at the county clerk's office recognized the property coordinates and called me. Sarah's frustration was palpable. By the time we can file an injunction, they could already reach the chamber. Elena's mind raced through options, each one more desperate than the last. Legal challenges would take weeks minimum. Federal intervention required proof of threat to protected sites. Tribal authorities had no jurisdiction over privately owned mineral rights unless they could establish cultural affiliation with the new chamber before it was breached. How long? Elena asked, how long before they break through? Sarah consulted another document. Based on the depth and their equipment specs, maybe 2 weeks. 3 if they hit complications. 2 weeks to protect something that had been hidden for centuries. 2 weeks to outmaneuver people with money, lawyers, and the law technically on their side. The Panther stood abruptly and walked to the door, looking back at Elena with clear intention. She wants me to follow, Elena said. Now, Elena, we need to strategize, file motions, contact Angela and Whitehorse. And we will, but first I need to see something. Elena grabbed her pack, checked her flashlight batteries. The Panther's been restless for weeks. I thought it was just summer behavior, but what if she knew? What if she's been trying to tell me about the 6th chamber? Sarah looked at the great cat, who waited with feline patience. You really think she understands what's happening? I think her bloodline has been protecting these sites for longer than we can imagine, and I think we should trust her. The Panther led Elena on a route she'd never taken before, higher up the mountain, past the petroglyphs in the known chambers, into territory so steep and remote that even game trails were scarce. They climbed for 2 hours, Elena's legs burning, lungs working hard in the thinning air. Finally, they reached a cliff face that looked like every other limestone outcropping in these mountains, until the Panther pawed at a specific section of rock and a hollow sound echoed back. Another entrance, Elena whispered. She pulled away vegetation, revealing a gap barely wide enough for a person. To the 6th chamber? The Panther chuffed affirmatively and slipped inside. Elena followed, squeezing through stone, descending into darkness that felt older and deeper than the other chambers. The passage twisted downward in a tight spiral, water trickling along one wall, the air growing colder with each step. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes, the passage opened into a space so vast that Elena's flashlight beam couldn't find the far walls. She pulled out a flare from her pack, cracked it, and threw it into the darkness. The chamber exploded into red light. It was enormous, easily the size of a football field, with a ceiling that soared 30 feet overhead. But it was what filled the chamber that made Elena's knees buckle. Not just artifacts, not just gold. An entire world preserved and waiting. In the center stood a wooden structure, a temple or council house, its timbers somehow preserved by the cave's constant temperature and humidity. Around it, arranged in careful patterns, were hundreds of pottery vessels, each one unique, each one a masterpiece of pre-Columbian artistry. Stone statues stood like sentinels, human figures, animal forms, beings that might have been gods or ancestors or both. And the gold, mountains of it, not scattered Spanish coins, but indigenous metalwork of breathtaking sophistication, pectorals hammered into images of the sun and moon, ceremonial masks with eyes that seemed alive in the flickering light, crowns and bracelets and objects whose purposes Elena could only guess at. But more than the artifacts, more than the treasure, the chamber held something else. Knowledge. The walls were covered, completely covered, in carvings, not just symbols, but what looked like a complete historical record. Scenes of daily life, astronomical observations, maps of trade routes, depictions of ceremonies, records of lineages stretching back generations. A comprehensive archive of a culture's accumulated wisdom, hidden away before conquistadors could destroy it. Oh my God, Elena breathed. This isn't just a treasure chamber. This is a library, a museum, a time capsule of everything they couldn't bear to lose. The Panther walked among the artifacts with familiar ease, as though she'd been here many times before. She led Elena to the wooden structure in the center, and when Elena approached, She saw that its entrance was marked with the same symbol from the petroglyphs, a panther with a sun disk above its head. Inside the structure, protected from even the cave's minimal moisture, were objects wrapped in what looked like ancient textiles. Elena carefully lifted one and found herself holding a book. Not a European book. Something older. Bark pages bound with sinew, covered in pictographic writing that predated anything in conventional archaeological records. She opened it carefully, and even without understanding the symbols, she could tell what it was. A genealogy, a record of lineages, of who came from whom, stretching back page after page into time immemorial. There were dozens of these books, hundreds maybe, a complete written record of a people who were supposed to have had no writing system. Elena's hand shook as she photographed the pages, the implications crashing over her like waves. This single chamber contained enough evidence to completely rewrite understanding of pre-Columbian North America, to prove that indigenous cultures had been far more sophisticated, far more advanced, far more connected than colonial narratives had ever acknowledged. And the New Heritage Foundation was about to drill into it, like miners breaking open a geode, destroying context, scattering artifacts, erasing the careful historical record that had been preserved here. The panther nudged her leg urgently. Elena looked up to see the great cat pawing at the far wall of the chamber, where a section of stone looked different, newer, disturbed recently. Elena approached and pressed her ear to the rock. Faintly, very faintly, she could hear something. A rhythmic thumping. Mechanical. Distant but getting closer. Drilling. They're already here, Elena whispered. They've reached the chamber from their side. The panther's ears flattened against her skull. A low rumble vibrated through her chest. Not quite a growl, but the sound of a predator preparing for confrontation. Elena pulled out her phone, praying for signal this deep in the mountain. 1 bar. Barely enough. She called Sarah. They're drilling into it right now, Elena said without preamble. Sarah, it's massive. It's incredible. It's everything we thought was lost. And they're about to destroy it. How long do we have? Elena pressed her hand against the rock, feeling vibrations. Hours maybe. Not more than a day. Then we're out of time for legal options. Sarah's voice was grim. Elena, I'm calling everyone. Angela, Whitehorse, every tribal representative we know, every journalist who covered the first case. We're going to flood that site with witnesses before they can breach the chamber. Make it impossible for them to excavate without the whole world watching. Do it. I'm going to document everything I can from this side. If they do break through, at least we'll have a record of what it looked like before they destroyed it. Elena spent the next 6 hours in a fever of documentation. She photographed every wall, every artifact arrangement, every carved symbol. She carefully opened and photographed pages from the bark books, working as quickly as she dared, while still being respectful of fragile materials. She measured, mapped, noted everything her training had taught her to observe. The panther stayed close, sometimes watching Elena work, sometimes pacing to the wall where the drilling sounds grew progressively louder. The great cat's agitation increased as the hours passed, a wildness returning to her movements that reminded Elena this was not a tame creature, but a force of nature temporarily allied with human purpose. As dawn light began filtering down through cracks in the chamber ceiling, revealing ventilation shafts that explained how the air stayed fresh, Elena's phone rang. Sarah's voice was breathless with urgency. "We've got 50 people on site. Tribal representatives, archaeologists, journalists, even some locals who heard what was happening. The Foundation has security to try and block access, but we got cameras rolling and people refusing to move. Can you stop them from drilling? Not legally, but we can sure as hell make them do it with the whole world watching. Angela's filing an emergency injunction right now. Whitehorse is calling every contact he has in federal preservation offices. We're buying time however we can. Keep buying it. I'm almost done here." But even as Elena said it, a sharp crack echoed through the chamber. She spun toward the sound. The wall the panther had been monitoring had fractured. A thin line split the stone from floor to ceiling, and through the crack, artificial light spilled in, harsh and wrong after hours of working by flashlight and flare. They'd broken through. Elena said into the phone. "Get out of there." "Elena, if they find you in that chamber, they could claim you're trespassing, interfering with legal excavation. I'm not leaving. Someone needs to protect this." She ended the call and walked toward the breach, the Panther falling into step beside her. Together, they watched as the crack widened, chunks of stone falling away, revealing the dark shaft of a tunnel on the other side. Voices echoed from the tunnel. Machinery shut down. Then footsteps. Robert Hawthorne emerged from a breach, flashlight in hand, followed by two men in mining gear and a woman carrying surveying equipment. He stopped when his light fell on Elena standing in the vast chamber, the Panther at her side, surrounded by treasures beyond counting. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Hawthorne smiled. "Dr. Marsh, I should have known you'd find a way in here first." "This chamber is protected under federal antiquities law," Elena said, her voice echoing in the vast space. "You're trespassing on a sacred site. Actually, we're conducting legal mineral extraction on property we own, and this chamber extends into our property, which means anything we find on our side belongs to us." His smile widened. "You may have won the last battle, Dr. Marsh, but this one is ours." The Panther's growl rumbled through the chamber like thunder. Hawthorne's flashlight beam found the great cat, and his smile faltered. "I'd suggest you control your pet. My colleague here is armed, and Tennessee law is very clear about protecting workers from dangerous animals." "She's not my pet," Elena said quietly. "She's a guardian, and you're threatening something she's protected for longer than your entire civilization has existed. Touching mythology, but ultimately meaningless." Hawthorne stepped fully into the chamber, his light sweeping across the artifacts. His breath caught. "My God, this is worth millions, tens of millions." "It's worth more than money," Elena said. "It's worth truth, history, the accumulated knowledge of a people who survived genocide, and you're not taking any of it." "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make." "Actually," a new voice said from the tunnel behind Hawthorne. "It is." Angela Swimmer emerged from the breach, followed by two federal marshals and a woman in a suit carrying an official-looking briefcase. "Robert Hawthorne," Angela said, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "You're hereby ordered to cease all excavation activities pending federal review. This chamber has been designated an emergency archaeological preservation site under the Antiquities Act, effective immediately." "On what grounds?" Hawthorne demanded. "You can't just—" The woman in the suit stepped forward. "Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, we received testimony from Dr. Marcus Webb regarding illegal artifact trafficking by your previous organization. We've also documented your ongoing attempts to circumvent federal protection orders through shell companies and mineral rights purchases. This excavation is suspended, Mr. Hawthorne, and you're going to be very busy with federal prosecutors for the foreseeable future." Hawthorne's face went through several shades of red. "This is harassment. I'll have your jobs. You'll comply with federal orders, or you'll be arrested for obstruction." Walsh interrupted calmly. "Your choice. But either way, you're done here." The marshals moved forward, and Hawthorne had no choice but to retreat back through the tunnel, his workers following. His final look at the chamber was pure avarice and rage. A man who glimpsed treasure and had it snatched away. When they were gone, Elena sank to the ground, adrenaline crash hitting her all at once. The Panther pressed against her side, warm and solid. Angela knelt beside her. "You did it. You bought us enough time to get the protections in place. This chamber, all of it, is now under permanent federal protection. How did you manage it so fast?" Dr. Whitehorse called in every favor he had. And when federal prosecutors saw Webb's evidence linking Hawthorne to artifact trafficking, they were very motivated to prevent further crimes. Angela's smile was fierce. "The New Heritage Foundation is finished. For real this time. Their assets are frozen, their permits revoked, their leadership facing criminal charges." Elena looked around the vast chamber, at treasures that would now be studied respectfully, preserved carefully, shared appropriately. "What happens now? Now we document everything properly, bring the right people, indigenous archaeologists, cultural experts, preservation specialists. We create protocols for how this site should be treated, who should have access, how the knowledge should be shared. Angela's voice softened. And we make sure the guardianship continues. Whatever agreement your ancestor made with the Panther bloodline, we honor it. As if in response, the Panther stood and walked to the wooden structure in the chamber center. She looked back at Elena, then Angela, then at the bark books and carved records surrounding them. Her golden eyes held ancient knowledge and modern urgency. "She's showing us," Elena whispered. "This is what matters. Not the gold, not the artifacts themselves. The knowledge, the history, the truth that was preserved here." Over the following weeks, the chamber was documented by the largest collaborative team of indigenous and academic archaeologists ever assembled. They worked under strict tribal oversight, with the Eastern Band having final say over all research protocols and publication decisions. What they discovered exceeded every expectation. The bark books contained not just genealogies but astronomical records, medicinal knowledge, agricultural techniques, and historical accounts spanning at least 2,000 years. Evidence of a continuous written tradition that predated European contact by millennia. The pottery vessels held organic materials that were still being analyzed, seeds from crops thought to have disappeared, medicines whose recipes had been lost, pigments whose sources had been forgotten. The carved walls told stories of trade networks spanning from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast to the Rocky Mountains. Stories of diplomatic alliances, peaceful interactions, and yes, conflicts and wars. A complete picture of indigenous North America as dynamic, sophisticated, and interconnected. And the gold, the Spanish gold that had started this entire journey, was revealed to have been deliberately repurposed, melted down conquistador plunder, recast into indigenous forms, transformed from symbols of colonial greed into monuments of resistance and survival. The media coverage was extensive, but thanks to careful management by tribal communications teams, respectful, the story became not about treasure discovered, but about knowledge recovered, about indigenous peoples reclaiming their own history, about the importance of protecting sacred sites from commercial exploitation. Elena gave exactly one interview to a journalist from an indigenous news outlet. In it, she said, "I didn't discover anything. The mountain revealed what it wanted revealed, when it wanted it revealed, through the guardians who protected it all along. I was just fortunate enough to be trusted with that responsibility." The interview went viral. But what resonated most wasn't the treasure or the artifacts. It was a photograph that accompanied it. Elena is standing at the chamber entrance, the Panther beside her, both silhouetted against a vast repository of preserved knowledge. Two guardians, one human, one wild, both serving something greater than themselves. A year later, on a crisp autumn morning that smelled with smoke and fallen leaves, Elena stood in the clearing in front of her cabin, watching a ceremony that would have been impossible just 2 years earlier. The Eastern Band had purchased the surrounding property from the defunct New Heritage Foundation's liquidation sale, ensuring the chambers would be permanently protected by people who understood their sacred significance. Today, they were dedicating a small cultural center, built respectfully at the mountain's base, far from the actual chambers, where tribal members could gather, where the knowledge from the bark books could be shared according to cultural protocols, where future generations could learn their own history in their own words. Dr. Whitehorse spoke, his voice carrying across the crowd of tribal elders, academics, journalists, and local residents who'd come to witness the dedication. For too long, our history has been told by others. Our sacred sites have been excavated by others. Our treasures have been claimed by others. Today, we reclaim not just these chambers, but the right to tell our own stories, preserve our own knowledge, determine our own futures. Applause rippled through the crowd. Angela Swimmer stepped forward to announce the first research project. A team of Cherokee scholars would spend the next 5 years translating and interpreting the bark books, creating both academic publications and educational materials for tribal communities. Sarah, now officially employed as the project's lead archivist, grinned at Elena from across the crowd. They'd come so far from that day in the library when Elena had walked back into her old friend's life with an impossible story and desperate plea for help. As the ceremony concluded, Elena slipped away from the crowd and walked back up the mountain. The Panther was waiting at the trailhead, as she'd known she would be. Together, they climbed to the petroglyphs, to the ancient carvings that had started everything. Elena sat on the stone, the Panther settling beside her, and they looked out over the valley below. Thomas Whitfield would be proud. Elena said quietly, "You kept faith across generations. You chose the right people to trust. You protected what mattered." The Panther's purr rumbled through the stone, through the mountain itself. Movement at the tree line caught Elena's attention. She tensed, then relaxed as a smaller shadow emerged from the forest. A cub. No, 2 cubs. Young panthers, maybe 6 months old, moving with the gangly grace of adolescence, still growing into their power. They approached cautiously, golden eyes identical to their mother's, studying Elena with careful intensity. The mother panther chuffed softly, and the cubs came closer. One of them, braver than the other, sniffed Elena's hand. Then, in a gesture that made Elena's throat tighten, the cub pressed its small head against a palm. The bloodline continued. The guardianship would persist. And these young ones were learning, even now, that some humans could be trusted, that protection could be shared, that the mountain secrets were worth defending. Elena's phone buzzed. A text from Angela. Next week, meeting with Smithsonian about repatriation of artifacts in their collection that match cultural patterns from the chambers. They're finally listening. You should be there. Another text from Sarah. Publisher wants to contract a book about the chambers. Indigenous co-authors, tribal oversight, all proceeds to Eastern Band education programs. Interested? And one from Dr. Whitehorse. We're establishing a scholarship program for Indigenous archaeology students. Would you consider serving on the selection committee? We need people who understand that protection sometimes matters more than publication. Elena looked at the messages, at the opportunities to continue the work, to help ensure that what had been preserved would be honored, that the guardianship would evolve to meet new challenges while staying true to its ancient purpose. She looked at the panther and her cubs, at the mountain stretching endlessly toward the horizon, at the valley below where a cultural center now stood as testament to survival and resistance and the power of secrets kept and strategically revealed. 3 years ago, she'd come to these mountains broken and hiding, convinced her life's work had been meaningless, her passion for truth a liability that had cost her everything. Now she understood that everything she'd lost had been preparation for finding this, that her destroyed career had freed her to be here, in this place at this moment, when the mountain needed someone who understood both the value of knowledge and the cost of exploitation. Yes, she said aloud, answering all 3 messages, answering the mountain itself, answering the trust that had been placed in her by panthers and ancestors and the accumulated weight of centuries. Yes, I'll keep going. I'll keep protecting. I'll keep faith. The mother panther stood, stretched, and began walking back toward the forest, her cubs following in her paw prints. At the tree line, she paused and looked back one more time. Elena raised her hand in acknowledgement, a promise, an oath renewed. Then the panthers melted into shadows, and Elena was alone on the mountain with stone guardians who'd witnessed this same scene play out across generations. Different humans, different panthers, same sacred purpose. Some things, Elena had learned, were meant to stay hidden, and some things were meant to be revealed, but only to the right people, at the right time, in the right way. The mountain knew the difference. The guardians knew the difference. And now, finally, so did she. She walked back down to the celebration, to the work that awaited, to a life that had found meaning in protection rather than publication, in guardianship rather than glory, in being part of something ancient and ongoing rather than chasing individual recognition. The chambers remained sealed, known only to those who needed to know, protected by laws and traditions and the unbroken line of guardians who kept faith across millennia. And somewhere in the forest, panther cubs learned the trails, memorized the entrances, absorbed the responsibility that would someday be theirs. The mountain breathed, the seasons turned, the guardianship continued, and Dr. Elena Marsh, who'd once lost everything, had found something worth far more than anything she'd ever dreamed of protecting. She'd found her place in a story much larger and longer than any single life, a story that would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by panthers and humans who understood that some truths were worth guarding, Some secrets were worth keeping, and some treasures were worth protecting from those who would reduce them to mere gold. The sun set over the mountains, painting the world in shades of fire and shadow. Elena smiled and walked toward her cabin, toward tomorrow's work, toward a future built on honor and trust and the sacred responsibility of guardianship. The mountain had chosen her, and she would not fail its trust. 5 years later, Elena stood in the great room of what had once been just her grandmother's cabin, and was now something more, a quiet sanctuary where guardianship was taught, where knowledge was passed down, where the next generation learned what it meant to protect rather than possess. The November wind rattled the windows, carrying the first hints of winter from the high peaks. Outside, snow dusted the ridge in delicate patterns that would deepen into drifts before spring returned. Inside, a fire crackled on the hearth, and seated around Elena's worn kitchen table were 4 young people who represented everything she and the others had been fighting for. Maya Kingfisher, 23, Cherokee, working on her doctorate in indigenous archaeology at the university where Elena had once taught. She'd grown up hearing stories about the chambers, about sacred sites desecrated and knowledge stolen, and had chosen to dedicate her life to changing that narrative. David Swimmer, Angela's nephew, 25, just finished his master's in cultural preservation. He carried his aunt's fierce protective instinct and had already blocked 2 separate development projects that threatened unmarked indigenous sites. Sarah Chen's daughter, Lisa, 19, studying both computer science and anthropology. She was building digital archives that allowed tribal communities to control access to their own cultural knowledge, preventing the kind of exploitation that had driven this entire struggle. And Marcus Webb's granddaughter, Claire, 21, studying geology like her grandfather but with completely different philosophy. Where he'd once surveyed for profit, she surveyed for protection, identifying vulnerable sites before developers could claim them. They represented the future of guardianship. Indigenous and non-indigenous, scientists and activists, all united by the understanding that some things matter more than careers or recognition or wealth. "Tell us again," Maya said, her notebook open but pen still. "How did you know to trust a panther?" Elena smiled, a question she'd answered 100 times but never tired of exploring. "I didn't know. Not at first. But she kept choosing trust when she could have chosen violence, kept offering gifts when she could have taken, kept revealing when she could have remained hidden. Eventually, I had to ask myself, was I brave enough to meet that trust with my own?" "And Thomas Whitfield?" David asked. "How did he first make contact with the Guardian bloodline?" "I found his journals 2 years ago," Elena said, pulling a leather-bound book from the shelf. "Hidden in a lockbox in my grandmother's attic. He wrote about finding an injured panther in 1961. Not unlike how I found mine. He nursed her back to health, and afterward, she started showing him things. The chambers, the petroglyphs, the network of sites his lumber company was about to destroy." She opened the journal to a page she'd marked, reading aloud. "I don't pretend to understand what's happening. A rational man would call me mad for believing a wild animal is acting with deliberate purpose. But I've seen her lead me to 5 different sacred sites. I've watched her protect them from intruders. And today, when I swore to her that I would keep these places secret, that I would die before betraying the locations, she looked at me with those golden eyes, and I swear she understood. We made a pact today, that panther and I, a promise that transcends species and spans generations." The room fell silent, except for the fire's crackling. Elena could see the weight of it settling on these young people. The realization that they weren't just studying history. They were becoming part of an unbroken chain of protection stretching back centuries. "The mother panther," Claire said quietly. "The one who brought you the artifacts. Where is she now?" Elena's throat tightened. "She died last winter. Old age, I think. She came to the cabin one final time, so weak she could barely walk. I sat with her on the porch all night. By morning, she was gone." "I'm sorry," Maya whispered. "Don't be. She lived a long life doing exactly what she was meant to do. And before she died..." Elena walked to the window, looking out at the forest. "She brought her daughter to meet me, and her granddaughters. The bloodline continues. The guardianship passes from one generation to the next, just as it always has." Movement in the trees caught her attention. A flash of black against white snow. The new guardian, daughter of the Panther who'd first trusted Elena, watching the cabin with the same golden-eyed intensity her mother had shown. "She's there now," David breathed, following Elena's gaze. "Watching us. She watches everyone who comes here. Every researcher, every tribal elder, every student. She's learning who to trust, just as her mother learned, just as her grandmother learned before that." Elena turned back to the group. "And that's what you're here to learn, too. Not just how to protect sites, but how to recognize who deserves access to them. How to tell the difference between people who want to preserve and people who want to profit." Lisa leaned forward. "Dr. Marsh, the digital archives I'm building, they're encrypted, access-controlled, designed to prevent exactly the kind of exploitation we've seen. But I keep wondering, is it better to lock knowledge away completely, or to share it carefully with people who've earned trust?" "That," Elena said, "is the question every guardian has to answer for themselves. Thomas chose complete secrecy. I chose strategic revelation. You'll have to choose what's right for your generation, your challenges, your world." She paused. "But I'll tell you what I've learned. Secrets kept too tightly eventually die. Secrets shared too freely lose their sacredness. The art is finding the balance. Like what you did with the bark books," Maya said, "allowing translation and publication, but only through indigenous scholars, only with tribal oversight, only with community consent at every stage." "Exactly. The knowledge isn't locked away. It's protected. There's a difference." Elena pulled out her laptop, opening files she prepared for this moment. "Which brings us to why you're really here. The Eastern Band has made a decision about the future of the Cultural Center and the Chamber Research. They want to establish a formal fellowship program, training the next generation of guardians, indigenous and allied scholars who continue this work when we're gone." She clicked through slides showing the program structure, academic training combined with traditional knowledge, legal education paired with cultural protocols, scientific methods integrated with spiritual respect. "You four are the first fellows," Elena said. "If you accept, it's a 10-year commitment minimum. You'll work with the existing chambers, help identify and protect new sites, train others who come after you. You'll face pressure from universities who want unrestricted access, from developers who see sacred land as profit potential, from treasure hunters who'll never stop trying to loot what we're protecting. But you'll also, a new voice added from the doorway, have the support of every tribal nation in the Southeast, Federal Protection Authority, and a network of guardians who've been doing this work for decades." Dr. Whitehorse stepped into the cabin, snow melting on his coat, followed by Angela Swimmer and Sarah Chun, the elder guardians, arriving to witness the torch being passed. "The chambers you've been protecting," Whitehorse continued, addressing the young people, "are just the beginning. We've identified at least 30 other sites across the Appalachians that show similar characteristics. Sacred repositories, hidden knowledge, each one vulnerable, each one needing people who understand that protection isn't about preventing access. It's about ensuring the right access, the right way for the right reasons." Angela set her briefcase on the table, pulling out official-looking documents. "These are the fellowship agreements. They include salary, benefits, research funding, and legal protection. Because make no mistake, this work will make you targets. Companies like the Old Heritage Foundation are gone, but the greed that drove them never dies. It just puts on new names and tries new strategies. We're offering you a chance," Sarah added, "to be part of something that matters. Not for glory. Most of what you do will never be public. Not for wealth. You can make more money in private sector archaeology. But for purpose, for protection, for ensuring that the next time someone discovers a sacred site, they choose guardianship over gold." The four young people looked at each other, silent conversations passing between them. Elena recognized that moment. The instant when idealism confronted reality, when abstract principles became concrete commitment, when you had to decide if you were willing to sacrifice easier paths for harder truths. Maya spoke first. "Where do I sign?" One by one, the others nodded. David, Lisa, Claire, each one accepting a responsibility that would shape the rest of their lives. As they signed the agreements, Elena felt something shift in her chest. Relief maybe. Or pride. Or the lightness that comes from knowing you're not alone anymore, that the weight you've been carrying can finally be shared. Outside, the panther silhouette moved through the trees, her cubs, nearly grown now, following in her paw prints, learning, watching, preparing for their own guardianship. That night, after the others had left and the new fellows had headed down to the cultural center for orientation, Elena sat alone on her porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a mug of tea warming her hands. The stars blazed overhead, untouched by light pollution this far from civilization. The same stars that had guided the people who created the chambers. The same patterns they carved into stone, preserving astronomical knowledge that modern science was only now beginning to appreciate. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Webb, now 81 and living in a retirement community in Asheville. Heard you found the next generation. Thomas will be proud. Hell, I'm proud. We did something that'll outlast us. Another message from a museum curator in Washington. Latest carbon dating confirms bark books are 3,200 years old, making them oldest written records in North America. This changes everything we thought we knew. Thank you for protecting them long enough for us to understand their significance. And one from Maya. Just sign on as a fellow. Saw the panther on my walk back. She followed me for half a mile, then vanished. I felt like I was being evaluated. Did I pass? Elena smiled and typed back, if she let you see her at all, you passed. Now the real work begins. She set down the phone and closed her eyes, listening to the mountain's night sounds. An owl called from the ridge. The creek murmured its eternal song. Wind whispered to the pines, carrying secrets that would never be fully known, mysteries that didn't need solving, truths that mattered more than facts. Footsteps on the porch made her eyes open. The panther had emerged from the darkness, moving with the silent grace of shadows made flesh. She settled beside Elena's chair, warm and solid. Her presence as familiar now as the cabin itself. They'll do well, Elena told her. The new guardians. They have the right spirit, the right balance of knowledge and humility. They understand what you and I learned, that some things are worth protecting even when the world doesn't understand why. The panther's purr rumbled through the porch boards. I'm getting older, Elena continued, voicing thoughts she usually kept private. I won't be able to make the climb to the chambers much longer. My knees are already complaining about these mountain winters. But now there are others, young ones with strong legs and sharp minds and hearts brave enough to choose this path. She reached down, resting her hand on the panther's head. Your daughters and granddaughters will teach them what you taught me. How to read the mountain's moods. How to recognize threats before they arrive. How to know who deserves trust and who deserves nothing but distance. The panther shifted, pressing closer. And Elena realized with start that the great cat was aging too. Gray had crept into the fur around her muzzle. Her movements, while still graceful, had lost some of their fluid power. They were both growing old together. These two guardians who protected the mountain's secrets for years that had passed like water over stone. We did good work, Elena whispered. Didn't we? We kept faith. We protected what needed protecting. We chose right when it would have been easier to choose wrong. A sound from the forest, a younger panther's call. The guardian lifted her head, answering with a low chuff. Her daughter, checking in, making sure the elder was safe. The bloodline continued. The protection persisted. And when Elena and this panther were both gone, others would stand watch, human and wild, keeping the ancient pact that Thomas Whitfield had first made in 1961, and that Elena had renewed when a wounded panther appeared on her porch asking for help.